The story of the assassins begins not with daggers in the night or mountain fortresses shrouded in mist, but with the fundamental question that divided the early Islamic world after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632. Who would lead the faithful? This question would fracture the Muslim community into branches that persist to this day, and from one of these branches would emerge a sect so mysterious and feared that their very name would enter the English language as a synonym for political murder. When Muhammad died without clearly naming a successor, the Muslim community faced its first great crisis. Some believed that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, possessed the divine right to lead as the first imam. Others supported Abu Bakr, Muhammad's close companion, who became the first caliph. This disagreement planted the seeds of the split between those who would become known as Sunnis, who accepted the caliphate system, and Shias, who believed legitimate authority rested only with Ali and his descendants. The Shia themselves would experience further divisions over generations, particularly regarding the succession of imams. After the sixth imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, died in 765, a dispute arose over his successor. The majority recognized his son Musa al-Qadim as the seventh imam, but a significant minority believed the imamate had passed to another son, Ismail, despite his death before his father. These supporters of Ismail became known as Ismailis, believing that his son Muhammad ibn Ismail was the true seventh imam. The Ismailis developed a sophisticated theological system that went beyond simple succession disputes. They embraced a cyclical view of history, dividing time into 7 prophetic eras, each initiated by a speaker prophet who brought an external revelation, accompanied by a silent one who unveiled its inner meaning. They believed that Muhammad was the 6th speaker prophet and Ali was his silent companion, and that the 7th and final era would be inaugurated by the Mahdi, who would reveal all hidden truths and establish perfect justice on earth. This esoteric interpretation of Islam emphasized the distinction between the external, apparent meaning of religious texts and their inner, hidden truths. The Ismailis developed elaborate systems of symbolic interpretation, seeing in every verse of the Quran layers of meaning accessible only to those properly initiated into their mysteries. This approach attracted intellectuals and mystics while simultaneously arousing suspicion among more orthodox Muslims who viewed such interpretations as dangerous innovations. By the 10th century, Ismaili missionaries had spread their doctrine from Yemen to North Africa, operating in secret cells and building networks of believers. Their greatest triumph came in 909 when they established the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa, claiming descent from Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, and Ali's wife. The Fatimids conquered Egypt in 969 and founded Cairo as their capital, creating a rival caliphate that challenged both the Sunni Abbasids in Baghdad and the Sunni Umayyads in Cordoba. The Fatimid period represented the golden age of Ismailism, when their beliefs moved from the shadows into the light of imperial power. Cairo became a center of learning that rivaled Baghdad, with the establishment of Al-Azhar Mosque and University, the House of Wisdom, and vast libraries that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The Fatimids promoted a culture of intellectual inquiry, supporting not just religious studies, but mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Into this world of religious ferment and political ambition was born Hassan-i Sabbah around 1050 in the Persian city of Qom, a center of Shia learning. His father was a 12er Shia, following the majority Shia belief in 12 imams, with the 12th having gone into occultation. Young Hassan received a traditional religious education, studying theology, philosophy, and law. Early accounts suggest he was a brilliant student with a penetrating mind and an intense, ascetic disposition that set him apart from his peers. The young Hassan moved to Rai near modern Tehran to continue his studies. Rai was a cosmopolitan city where different Islamic schools of thought competed for influence, and where Ismaili missionaries operated alongside Sunni scholars and Twelver Shia clerics. It was here that Hassan first encountered Ismaili teachings through a missionary named Amir Zarab, who introduced him to the complex theological arguments that distinguished Ismaili thought. Hassan initially resisted these new ideas, engaging in lengthy debates with Ismaili teachers. He was particularly troubled by their doctrine of the imamate and their allegorical interpretations of scripture, yet the logical consistency of their arguments and their solution to the problem of religious authority gradually won him over. After a serious illness that brought him close to death, Hassan experienced what he described as a spiritual awakening and formally converted to Ismailism around 1072. His conversion was not merely a change of religious allegiance, but a complete transformation of purpose. Hassan threw himself into studying Ismaili texts and doctrine with the same intensity he had once applied to refuting them. He learned the complex hierarchy of Ismaili initiation, the sophisticated techniques of argumentation used by their missionaries, and the organizational methods that had allowed them to survive and spread despite persecution. The Ismaili leadership in Persia recognized Hassan's intellectual gifts and dedication. They selected him for advanced training and eventually decided he should travel to Cairo to study at the center of Ismaili power. This journey, undertaken around 1076, would prove transformative not just for Hassan but for the entire future of Ismailism. The young convert set out for Egypt filled with idealistic expectations of the Fatimid Caliphate as the embodiment of divine justice and spiritual truth. The journey to Cairo was itself an education. Hassan traveled through Isfahan, Yazd, Kerman, and then along the Persian Gulf to Syria, observing the various Muslim communities and their conditions under different rulers. He witnessed the growing power of the Seljuk Turks who had recently conquered much of Persia and were expanding westward. He saw how Ismaili communities survived as minorities, practicing their faith in secret while outwardly conforming to Sunni or Twelver Shia practices. When Hassan finally reached Cairo around 1078, the reality he encountered differed sharply from his expectations. The Fatimid Caliphate was past its zenith, weakened by internal struggles and external pressures. The Caliph al-Mustansir had ruled for over 40 years, but real power was exercised by competing military factions, particularly the Armenian general Badr al-Jamali. The court was consumed by luxury and political intrigue rather than spiritual pursuits and religious scholarship. Hassan spent approximately 3 years in Egypt, studying at Al-Azhar and other institutions while observing the Fatimid system closely. He was received at court and had audiences with high officials, but what he saw disappointed him profoundly. The Fatimid elite seemed more concerned with maintaining their worldly power than spreading the Ismaili message or preparing for the coming of the Mahdi. The elaborate court ceremonies and Byzantine protocols contrasted sharply with the austere dedication Hassan believed the true faith demanded. More troubling still was the succession dispute that was already beginning to simmer. Al-Mustansir had numerous sons, and different court factions supported different candidates. Hassan recognized that this dispute would likely tear the Fatimid Caliphate apart after Al-Mustansir's death, fragmenting the Ismaili movement at the very moment when unity was essential. He began to envision a different path for Ismailism, one that would not depend on the fragile edifice of temporal power. During his time in Cairo, Hassan also studied Fatimid administrative methods, their techniques of propaganda and missionary organization, and their military strategies. He paid particular attention to how they maintained communication with distant Ismaili communities and how they recruited and trained their missionaries. All of this knowledge would prove invaluable when he later established his own independent Ismaili state. The exact circumstances of Hassan's departure from Egypt remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he was expelled due to his support for Nizar, Al-Mustansir's eldest son and designated heir, against the faction supporting a younger son. Others indicate Hassan left voluntarily, disillusioned with Fatimid decadence, and convinced that the future of Ismailism lay elsewhere. Whatever the immediate cause, Hassan left Cairo around 1081 with a new vision forming in his mind. The return journey to Persia was slower and more deliberate than his trip to Cairo. Hassan stopped in various cities, making contact with Ismaili communities and assessing the political landscape. In Syria, he observed the fragmentation of Muslim power and the growing threat of Crusader invasions. In Iraq, he witnessed the nominal authority of the Abbasid Caliphate and the real power of their Seljuk overlords. Throughout his travels, he recruited followers and established cells of believers who would form the foundation of his future network. By the time Hassan returned to Persia in 1081, he had transformed from an idealistic convert into a strategic thinker with a revolutionary vision. He understood that Ismailism could not survive as a minority faith dependent on the protection of increasingly weak Fatimid caliphs, nor could it compete with the Seljuks in conventional military terms. What was needed was an entirely new strategy, one that would allow a small but dedicated community to survive and even thrive, despite being surrounded by powerful enemies. Hassan spent the next several years traveling throughout Persia as an Ismaili missionary, but his mission went beyond simple conversion. He was carefully mapping the political and geographical landscape, identifying potential bases of operation, and recruiting not just believers but potential fighters and administrators. He paid particular attention to the mountainous regions of northern Persia, where the terrain itself could serve as a defense against larger armies. The Elburz Mountains, stretching along the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, particularly attracted his attention. These mountains were populated by various heterodox communities who had long resisted central authority, whether Arab, Persian, or Turkish. Many retained pre-Islamic beliefs and practices beneath a veneer of Islam. They were natural allies for anyone seeking to establish an independent power base outside the control of the Seljuk state. Hassan also recognized that the Seljuk Empire, despite its apparent strength, had significant vulnerabilities. It was a tribal confederation held together by personal loyalties rather than institutional structures. The death of a strong sultan often led to succession disputes and civil wars. The empire was also stretched thin, trying to control vast territories from Central Asia to Anatolia. A small but well-organized force operating from secure bases could survive and even prosper by exploiting these weaknesses. The theoretical framework Hassan developed during this period would guide the Nizari Ismaili state for the next century and a half. He envisioned a network of impregnable mountain fortresses that would serve as both defensive positions and centers for missionary activity. From these bases, carefully trained agents would spread Ismaili teachings while also gathering intelligence and, when necessary, eliminating key enemies of the faith. It was a strategy that prioritized quality over quantity, dedication over numbers, and precision over brute force. By 1088, Hassan had identified his primary target, the fortress of Alamut in the Elburz Mountains. Alamut, meaning eagle's nest in Persian, sat atop a steep rock outcropping at an elevation of over 2,000 meters. It commanded the strategic valley of the Alamut River and controlled important trade routes between the Caspian region and the Persian interior. The fortress had been built in 860 by a Zaydi Shia ruler, but was now held by a Seljuk governor. Hassan began his campaign to capture Alamut, not with soldiers, but with missionaries. He sent his agents into the valley to convert the local population, village by village, family by family. These missionaries presented Ismailism not just as a theological system, but as a liberation movement that would free the people from Seljuk oppression and establish divine justice. They emphasized the coming of the Mahdi and the special role the people of Alamut would play in this cosmic drama. the strategy proved remarkably effective. Within 2 years, most of the valley's population had converted to Ismailism, though they kept their conversion secret from the Seljuk authorities. Hassan himself entered the valley disguised as a teacher, living quietly in a village while directing the conversion campaign. By 1090, even many of the soldiers garrisoning Alamut had secretly accepted the Ismaili faith, waiting only for the signal to declare their allegiance openly. The transformation of Hassan-i Sabbah from scholarly convert to revolutionary leader was complete. The idealistic young man who had traveled to Cairo seeking spiritual truth had become a master strategist, preparing to launch one of history's most remarkable insurgencies. The disappointments of Egypt had not destroyed his faith, but had instead forged it into something harder and more pragmatic. He understood that in a world dominated by Turkish military might and Sunni orthodoxy, the Ismailis could survive only by creating their own reality, their own state, and their own unique form of warfare. As Hassan prepared for the final phase of his plan to capture Alamut, he could not have imagined that he was about to establish a state that would survive for over a century and a half, striking fear into the hearts of sultans and kings. Nor could he have known that his followers would become so legendary that their name would echo through the centuries, transformed and mythologized, but never forgotten. The autumn of 1090 would mark not an ending, but a beginning, the birth of the society that history would remember as the Assassins. The morning of September 4th, 1090 dawned clear and cold over the Alamut Valley. Inside the fortress, the Seljuk governor Mahdi arose, unaware that this would be his last day as master of the Eagle's Nest. For months, strange reports had reached him about religious teachers in the valley villages, but he had dismissed them as harmless mystics. He did not know that Hassan-i Sabbah had been living in the valley for months, that most of his own garrison had converted to Ismailism, or that the careful plans laid over 2 years were about to bear fruit. Hassan had chosen his moment carefully. The Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah was campaigning in Central Asia, too distant to respond quickly to events in the Elburz Mountains. Local Seljuk forces were dispersed, dealing with various minor rebellions and border conflicts. The harvest was complete, ensuring the valley could sustain itself through a siege if necessary. Most importantly, the psychological preparation of both the local population and the garrison was complete. They awaited only Hassan's signal to declare their allegiance openly. The takeover itself was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Hassan's followers within the fortress simply revealed themselves to the governor, informing him that Alamut now belonged to the Ismaili Imam. The governor, finding himself surrounded by his own converted soldiers and with no hope of relief from a population that had entirely embraced the new faith, had little choice but to negotiate his departure. Hassan, demonstrating the combination of pragmatism and honor that would characterize his rule, allowed Mahdi to leave unharmed with a payment of 3,000 gold dinars as compensation for his lost property. Hassan entered Alamut not as a conqueror, but as a teacher returning home. He would not leave the fortress again for the remaining 34 years of his life, transforming himself from an active missionary into an almost mythical figure whose presence was felt throughout the Ismaili world, even as his physical form remained hidden within Alamut's walls. This voluntary isolation served multiple purposes, creating an aura of mystery around his leadership, while also demonstrating his complete dedication to the cause rather than personal glory or comfort. The fortress Hassan inherited was formidable, but required significant improvements to serve his purposes. Alamut sat atop a narrow ridge approximately 180 meters above the valley floor, with sheer cliffs on 3 sides. The only approach was a narrow track that wound up the southwestern face, easily defended by a handful of soldiers. The fortress itself consisted of stone buildings clustered around a central courtyard, with storage chambers carved into the living rock and cisterns that collected rainwater to ensure water supply during sieges. Hassan immediately began expanding and strengthening these defenses. He ordered the construction of additional storehouses capable of holding supplies for extended sieges. The water storage system was expanded and improved, with new cisterns carved from solid rock and channels designed to capture every drop of rain and snowmelt. The narrow approach path was fortified with gates and guard posts at strategic points, creating multiple defensive positions that would have to be overcome one by any attacker. Beyond physical defenses, Hassan established Alamut as an intellectual and spiritual center. He created one of the most remarkable libraries in the Islamic world, collecting texts not just on religion and philosophy, but on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and alchemy. Ismaili scholars and scientists were invited to take residence, transforming the mountain fortress into an unlikely center of learning. Hassan himself was said to spend most of his time in study and writing, producing treatises on Ismaili doctrine that would guide the movement for generations. The agricultural development of the Alamut Valley was equally important. Hassan understood that true independence required economic self-sufficiency. He ordered the construction of sophisticated irrigation systems that maximized the limited arable land in the mountain valleys. Terraced gardens were carved into the mountainsides, growing not just food crops but also medicinal plants. The famous gardens of Alamut, which later travelers would describe with wonder, began during this period as practical projects to ensure the community's survival. The success at Alamut sent shockwaves through the Seljuk establishment. Here was not merely another local rebellion to be crushed, but an ideological challenge to the entire order. The Seljuks had taken control of most of Persia by defeating conventional armies in open battle, but Hassan offered no such armies to defeat. Instead, he presented a model of resistance that could be replicated anywhere there were mountains and dissatisfied populations. The implications were terrifying for an empire that ruled through military superiority rather than popular legitimacy. Sultan Malik Shah initially underestimated the threat, dispatching a regional commander with a modest force to retake Alamut. This first expedition in 1091 failed completely. The Seljuk forces found the valley populated entirely by hostile inhabitants who harassed their supply lines and provided intelligence to the defenders. When they finally reached Alamut itself, they discovered that conventional siege tactics were useless against a fortress with adequate supplies perched on an inaccessible rock. After several costly attempts to storm the narrow approach path, the expedition withdrew in defeat. This initial victory galvanized Ismaili communities throughout Persia. Hassan had demonstrated that the Seljuks were not invincible, that with proper preparation and favorable terrain, a small, dedicated force could resist the might of the empire. Ismaili missionaries spread this message through secret networks, and soon other communities began considering similar actions. Hassan, recognizing the opportunity, dispatched trusted lieutenants to identify and acquire additional fortresses that could serve as regional centers for the expanding Nizari Ismaili state. The second major acquisition came in 1092 with the capture of Lamsar fortress, also in the Elburz mountains but controlling different valleys and trade routes. Like Alamut, Lamsar was taken through conversion and negotiation rather than military assault. The pattern was establishing itself as the template for Nizari expansion. Missionaries would work for months or years to convert the local population, then leverage that popular support to gain control of strategic fortresses, either through the conversion of their garrisons or through negotiations backed by the implicit threat of popular uprising. The Seljuk response to this expanding threat revealed the fundamental weakness of their system. Different commanders pursued different strategies without coordination. Some attempted direct military assault, sending armies that foundered against mountain fortresses and hostile populations. Others tried to isolate Ismaili territories through economic blockade, but the mountain communities had always been largely self-sufficient. Still others attempted to counter Ismaili missionaries with their own religious authorities, but Sunni orthodoxy could not match the appeal of Ismaili teachings among populations that had never fully accepted Sunni dominance. Hassan exploited these divided responses brilliantly. When Seljuk forces concentrated against one fortress, Ismaili agents would become active elsewhere, converting new communities or eliminating local officials who were particularly effective in suppressing Ismaili activities. When the Seljuks dispersed their forces to cover more territory, individual garrisons became vulnerable to surprise attacks or subversion. The conventional military superiority that had brought the Seljuks to power became almost irrelevant against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. The theological framework supporting this new form of resistance was as carefully constructed as the physical fortifications. Hassan elaborated a doctrine that justified both defensive warfare and, when necessary, the elimination of enemies of the faith. He argued that in the absence of the visible imam who had gone into concealment, the community had not just the right, but the obligation to defend itself against oppression. This defense could take many forms, from the construction of physical refuges to the preemptive elimination of those who would destroy the faithful. The concept of the concealed imam became central to Nizari theology during this period. While the Fatimids in Cairo claimed their caliph was the visible imam, Hassan taught that the true imam had withdrawn from a corrupted world and would return only when the community had proven itself worthy through struggle and sacrifice. In the meantime, Hassan positioned himself not as the imam but as his deputy or proof, the hujjah, who maintained the community and prepared for the imam's eventual return. This theological innovation freed the Nizaris from dependence on the increasingly weak Fatimid Caliphate while maintaining their core Ismaili beliefs. The administrative system Hassan established reflected both practical necessities and theological principles. Each fortress and its surrounding territory functioned as a semi-autonomous unit capable of surviving independently if cut off from the others. Yet all were bound together by absolute loyalty to Hassan as the imam's representative and by shared adherence to Nizari doctrine. Communication between fortresses was maintained through a sophisticated system of messengers and signals, allowing coordination despite the distances and difficult terrain separating them. The selection and training of personnel for this expanding state required careful attention. Hassan needed not just soldiers but administrators, teachers, engineers, and agriculturalists. He established training programs at Alamut for promising young Ismailis, educating them in both practical skills and religious doctrine. The most talented might spend years in preparation, studying everything from siege engineering to the subtleties of theological debate. This investment in human capital would prove one of the Nizari state's greatest strengths. The economic foundation of the Nizari state combined several elements. Agricultural production in the valleys provided basic subsistence. Control of trade routes generated customs revenues, as merchants had to pass through Nizari territory to move goods between the Caspian region and central Persia. Contributions from Ismaili communities outside Nizari territory provided additional resources. Finally, tribute extracted from neighboring regions in exchange for protection or simply to avoid attacks supplemented the treasury. This diversified economic base proved remarkably resilient even during extended conflicts. By late 1092, Hassan controlled a network of fortresses throughout the Elburz Mountains and was beginning to establish positions in other mountain ranges. The Seljuk Empire, distracted by internal conflicts and external threats, seemed unable to formulate an effective response. Then on October 14, 1092, an event occurred that would define the Nizari Ismailis in the imagination of both their contemporaries and history. Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier who had been the architect of Seljuk power for 30 years, was assassinated by a Nizari agent while traveling between Isfahan and Baghdad. The death of Nizam al-Mulk sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world that went far beyond the elimination of a single official. Here was proof that Hassan's followers could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The vizier had been surrounded by guards, protected by the full might of the Seljuk state, yet a single, determined assassin had reached him. The psychological impact was enormous. If Nizam al-Mulk was not safe, who was? Every official, every commander, every religious authority who opposed the Ismailis now had to wonder if they might be next. Sultan Malik Shah himself died just weeks after his vizier under mysterious circumstances that many attributed to poison, though this was never proven. Whether or not the Nizaris were responsible, the timing of his death seemed too convenient to be coincidental. The Seljuk Empire immediately fragmented as Malik Shah's sons fought for succession, giving Hassan exactly the respite he needed to consolidate his gains. The chaos that followed would last for years, during which the Nizari state transformed from a precarious experiment to an established reality. The strategy of targeted assassination that would make the Nizaris famous, or infamous, emerged during this period not as a preferred tactic, but as a necessity. Hassan commanded perhaps 3,000 fighters scattered across dozens of fortresses, facing an empire that could mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Conventional warfare was impossible, but by eliminating key figures who were particularly effective against the Ismailis, or who were planning attacks on Nizari territories, Hassan could achieve strategic effects far beyond what his limited forces could accomplish through conventional means. The selection of targets was never random or motivated by simple terrorism. Each assassination was carefully planned to achieve specific strategic goals. Priority was given to those actively planning or leading military campaigns against Ismaili territories. Religious authorities who preached against Ismailism and inspired persecution of Ismaili communities were also targeted. Local governors who were particularly harsh in suppressing Ismaili activities might find themselves on the list. The message was clear and consistent. Leave the Ismailis alone, and they would leave you alone. Attack them and face the consequences. The training of the fedayeen, the self-sacrificing devotees who carried out these missions, became one of the most mysterious aspects of Nizari practice. Young men were selected for their intelligence, physical capabilities, and above all, their absolute dedication to the faith. They would spend years in preparation, learning not just combat skills, but languages, customs, and the ability to blend into different environments. A fedai might spend months or even years establishing himself in a target's household, gaining trust and access, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The psychological preparation of the fedayeen was as important as their physical training. They had to be ready not just to kill, but to die, as escape was rarely possible after a public assassination. This readiness for self-sacrifice was grounded in theological conviction. The fedayeen believed that by dying in service to the imam's cause, they would achieve immediate paradise. This was not a simple promise of material rewards in the afterlife, but a complex theological position about the nature of martyrdom and divine justice. The methods used to maintain this absolute dedication became the subject of wild speculation among the Nizari's enemies. Stories circulated about gardens designed to resemble paradise where young men were drugged and then told they had received a foretaste of the rewards awaiting them after martyrdom. These tales, spread by hostile sources and later embellished by European crusaders, have little basis in historical evidence. The reality was likely both more mundane and more impressive: careful selection, intensive education, and the power of genuine religious conviction. The fortresses themselves evolved during this period from simple defensive positions to complex communities. Each major fortress developed its own character and specializations. Alamut remained the spiritual and administrative center, housing the main library and Hassan's residence. Lamsar became a military training center where young Ismailis learned the arts of war. Gerdku Fortress, established in 1096 in the mountains of Kumis, developed into a center for agricultural experimentation, developing new crops and techniques suited to mountain terrain. The daily life in these mountain communities combined military discipline with surprising cultural sophistication. Education was mandatory for all children, both boys and girls, a remarkable policy for the time. The curriculum included not just religious instruction but mathematics, astronomy, and practical skills. The libraries were open to all residents, and debate and discussion were encouraged. This emphasis on education created a population that was not just loyal, but capable, able to understand and contribute to the complex project of building a new form of society. Women in the Nizari communities enjoyed greater freedom and opportunities than was common in the medieval Islamic world. While they did not serve as soldiers or assassins, women participated in agricultural work, education, and even administrative roles. Some accounts suggest that Hassan's own daughters were educated scholars who contributed to the intellectual life of Alamut. This relative gender equality was partly practical, as the small population required everyone's contributions, but it also reflected Ismaili theological principles about the spiritual equality of all believers. The agricultural innovations developed in the Nizari territories had lasting impacts on mountain agriculture throughout Persia. Faced with limited arable land and harsh climatic conditions, Nizari engineers developed sophisticated terracing techniques that maximized productivity. They experimented with crop varieties to find those best suited to high altitudes and short growing seasons. The irrigation systems they constructed, channeling snowmelt and seasonal rains, were marvels of engineering that continued to function for centuries after the Nizari state itself had disappeared. The question of succession and leadership continuity was addressed early in Hassan's rule. Unlike many revolutionary leaders who cannot envision their movement without themselves, Hassan carefully prepared for the future. He established clear protocols for succession, created institutional structures that would survive individual leaders, and most importantly, grounded authority in ideological rather than personal terms. The next leader would derive legitimacy not from personal charisma, but from proper designation and adherence to established doctrine. As the first decade of Hassan's rule at Alamut drew to a close, the Nizari Ismaili state had evolved from an improbable dream to an established reality. What had begun as one man's vision of an independent Ismaili community had grown into a network of fortresses controlling significant territory and influencing events throughout the Eastern Islamic world. The Seljuk Empire, which had seemed invincible just years before, now had to accommodate itself to the permanent presence of an enemy it could neither destroy nor fully contain. The defensive strategies developed during these early years would prove remarkably durable. For the next century and a half, successive waves of enemies would break against the mountain fortresses like ocean waves against coastal cliffs. The Seljuks would try repeatedly to eliminate the Nizari state, launching major campaigns that achieved temporary successes but never final victory. The fortresses might be besieged, the valleys ravaged, but as soon as the attacking armies withdrew, the Nizaris would emerge from their refuges and rebuild. The transformation Hassan had achieved by 1100 was remarkable by any measure. He had taken a persecuted religious minority and given them their own state. He had developed a form of asymmetric warfare that allowed the weak to resist the strong effectively. He had created institutions that would outlive him by generations, Most remarkably, he had done all this while rarely leaving the confines of Alamut fortress, ruling through the power of ideas and the dedication of followers rather than through personal presence or conventional military force. The foundation was now laid for one of history's most unusual and enduring political experiments. The mountain fortresses of the Nizari Ismailis were more than military strongholds. They were laboratories for a revolutionary experiment in human organization, centers where an elaborate theological system merged with practical governance to create something entirely new in the medieval Islamic world. The ideology that Hassan-i Sabbah propagated from Alamut was not merely a variant of Ismaili Islam, but a complete worldview that redefined the relationship between religious authority, political power, and individual salvation. At the heart of Nizari philosophy lay the concept of ta'lim, the authoritative teaching that could only come from the divinely guided imam or his appointed representatives. This was not simply religious instruction in the conventional sense, but a claim to exclusive access to divine truth. In a world where competing interpretations of Islam proliferated and religious scholars debated endlessly about proper practice and belief, the Nizaris offered certainty. The Imam alone possessed the divine inspiration to interpret the true meaning of revelation, and only through accepting his teaching could believers achieve spiritual enlightenment and salvation. This doctrine of ta'lim addressed a fundamental problem that had plagued Islam since the Prophet's death. How could believers know with certainty what God required of them, when the Quran could be interpreted in multiple ways and the Hadith traditions often contradicted each other? Sunni Islam had developed the concept of ijma, consensus of the community, and relied on trained religious scholars to interpret sacred texts. But the Nizaris argued this approach led only to confusion and error. Human reason alone could never penetrate divine mysteries. What was needed was continuing divine guidance through the living Imam. The Imam in Nizari theology was far more than a political leader or even a religious authority. He was the proof of God on earth, the speaking Quran, the gate through which divine knowledge entered the world. Every prophet had brought an external revelation suited to his age, but the inner meaning of these revelations, the truths that connected all religions, could only be unveiled by the Imam. This elevated the Imam beyond any earthly authority, making obedience to him not just a political obligation, but a religious necessity for salvation. The apparent absence of the Imam presented a theological challenge that Hassan addressed through sophisticated doctrinal innovations. The true Imam, he taught, had entered a period of concealment, withdrawing from a corrupted world that was not yet ready for his full revelation. This concealment was not abandonment, but a test of the faithful and a period of preparation. During this time, the Imam continued to guide the community through his chosen representatives, the hujjas or proofs, who maintained the teaching and prepared for the Imam's eventual return. Hassan himself claimed to be such a hujjah, speaking with the Imam's authority while carefully avoiding any claim to be the Imam himself. This distinction was crucial, as it allowed him to demand absolute obedience while maintaining the theological framework that reserved ultimate authority for the hidden Imam. The followers were not obeying Hassan as an individual, but Hassan as the vessel through which the Imam's will was expressed. This depersonalization of authority would prove essential for maintaining unity after Hassan's death. The sophisticated philosophical system underlying Nizari beliefs drew from multiple sources. Neoplatonic concepts of emanation explained how divine knowledge descended through hierarchical levels of being. Ancient Persian dualistic traditions influenced their understanding of the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Sufi mystical practices shaped their approaches to spiritual development. Yet these diverse elements were synthesized into a coherent system that was uniquely Nizari, neither purely Islamic nor simply syncretic, but something genuinely new. The cyclical view of history that the Nizaris inherited from earlier Ismaili thought took on special significance in Hassan's interpretation. History moved through great cycles, each initiated by a prophet who brought a new religious law suited to his era. But within each prophetic cycle were smaller cycles of concealment and manifestation, periods when divine truth was hidden and periods when it blazed forth. The Nizaris believed they were living in a crucial transitional period when one age was ending and another about to begin. Their struggles and sacrifices were not merely political resistance but participation in a cosmic transformation. This apocalyptic element in Nizari thought should not be understood as passive waiting for divine intervention. Rather, it demanded active preparation for the coming transformation. The faithful had to purify themselves through study and devotion, strengthen their community through mutual support, and remove obstacles to the Imam's return by eliminating his enemies. Every action taken by the Nizari state, from agricultural improvements to assassination operations, was understood within this framework of preparing the world for a new age of divine justice. The process of recruiting new members to this ideological system was carefully structured and remarkably sophisticated for its time. Nizari missionaries, known as dais, did not simply preach to crowds or engage in public debates. Instead, they identified individuals who showed intellectual curiosity, spiritual hunger, or dissatisfaction with existing religious authorities. The approach to each potential convert was tailored to their specific circumstances, concerns, and level of understanding. The initial contact might come through seemingly casual philosophical discussions or expressions of sympathy for someone's grievances against local authorities. The da'i would gradually introduce questions that revealed contradictions in orthodox teaching or problems that conventional Islam could not satisfactorily answer. Why did an omnipotent and just God allow evil to flourish? How could the Quran be perfect and complete if scholars disagreed about its meaning? These questions were not answered immediately, but left to germinate in the potential convert's mind. Only when someone expressed genuine interest in learning more would the formal process of initiation begin. This proceeded through multiple stages, each revealing deeper levels of esoteric knowledge. The early stages might focus on moral philosophy and the importance of seeking truth, content that would not seem threatening to orthodox authorities if discovered. Middle stages introduced specifically Ismaili concepts like the distinction between external religious law and internal spiritual truth. The highest stages, revealed only to the most trusted initiates, unveiled the full Nizari doctrine, including the nature of the Imam and the cosmic significance of their struggle. This graduated system of initiation served multiple purposes beyond simple education. It created powerful psychological bonds as initiates felt themselves progressively admitted to an inner circle of those who possessed secret knowledge. It allowed the da'is to assess the commitment and reliability of converts before revealing dangerous doctrines. It also protected the organization, as captured members at lower levels of initiation could reveal little of value to enemies. The sense of being special, of possessing truths hidden from the masses, created a powerful motivation for loyalty and sacrifice. The training of da'is themselves required years of preparation. Selected from among the most intelligent and dedicated young Nizaris, they studied not just Ismaili theology, but comparative religion, philosophy, logic, and rhetoric. They learned to argue from the premises of different schools of thought, to identify the weaknesses in various theological positions, and to guide discussions toward predetermined conclusions while making their interlocutors feel they were discovering truths for themselves. They studied human psychology, learning to recognize different personality types and adjust their approaches accordingly. Beyond intellectual preparation, da'is received practical training in survival skills, languages, and regional customs. A missionary might need to pose as a merchant, a scholar, a mystic, or a craftsman. They learned to adopt different accents and mannerisms to blend into various social environments and to establish credible cover identities that could withstand scrutiny. Some Daris spent years building reputations in target communities before beginning their real work, becoming trusted teachers or advisors who could influence entire populations. The fedayeen represented a special category within the Nizari hierarchy, dedicated warriors prepared to sacrifice their lives for the faith. Their selection process was even more rigorous than that of the Dais, looking not just for intelligence and dedication, but for a particular psychological profile. The ideal candidate combined absolute faith with emotional stability, physical courage with strategic patience, independence of action with complete obedience to authority. These seemingly contradictory qualities were essential for individuals who might spend years on a mission culminating in a moment requiring instant, decisive action. The training of fedayeen has been surrounded by myth and speculation, but the reality was likely both more mundane and more sophisticated than the legends suggest. Physical training certainly played a role, including not just combat techniques, but stamina building, pain resistance, and control of involuntary responses that might reveal tension or fear. They learned multiple methods of killing, from blade work to poisons, but more importantly, they learned when and how to strike for maximum psychological impact. Languages and cultural knowledge were essential for fedayeen who might need to operate far from Nizari territories. A fedai assigned to eliminate a target in Damascus needed to speak Arabic with the appropriate accent, understand local customs, and navigate the city's social networks. Some fedayeen specialized in particular regions or types of targets, developing expertise that made them valuable for specific operations. The investment in training a single fedai was enormous, making their deployment a decision never taken lightly. The psychological preparation of fedayeen focused on developing unshakable conviction in their mission's righteousness. They studied theological texts that emphasized the glory of martyrdom and the rewards awaiting those who died serving the imam. They participated in elaborate ceremonies that reinforced group identity and individual commitment. They formed bonds with fellow fedayeen who would remember and honor them after their deaths. This was not brainwashing in the modern sense, but a careful cultivation of beliefs and emotions that would sustain them through long missions and terminal actions. The stories about gardens of paradise and drug-induced visions used to motivate fedayeen were largely fabrications by hostile sources, but they point to a real mystery about how the Nizaris maintained such absolute dedication among their operatives. Part of the answer lies in the totalizing nature of Nizari ideology, which provided meaning for every aspect of life and death. Part lies in the careful selection process that identified individuals already inclined toward self-sacrifice. Part lies in the honor and status accorded to fedayeen within Nizari society, where they were celebrated as heroes rather than mere instruments. The relationship between the fedayeen and the broader Nizari community was complex and carefully managed. While honored for their dedication, active fedayeen were often kept separate from the general population, living in special quarters and following distinct routines. This separation served practical purposes, maintaining operational security and preventing emotional attachments that might compromise missions. It also created an aura of mystery around the fedayeen that enhanced their psychological impact on enemies who could never know which servant, merchant, or traveler might be a hidden assassin. The ethical framework justifying assassination required sophisticated theological argumentation. Islam generally prohibits murder and suicide, yet the Nizaris developed doctrines that transformed these acts into religious duties under specific circumstances. They argued that removing enemies of the imam was not murder, but a surgical excision of corruption from the body of Islam. The fedayeen who died in such operations were not suicides but martyrs, who chose certain death in service to divine truth. These arguments might not convince orthodox theologians, but they provided the intellectual framework necessary for the Nizaris to reconcile their methods with their religious beliefs. The concept of taqiyya, permitted dissimulation to protect the faith, took on special significance in Nizari practice. While Shia Islam generally allowed believers to conceal their true beliefs when facing persecution, the Nizaris elevated this to a sophisticated art. A Nizari living in Sunni territories might spend decades outwardly conforming to Sunni practice, even serving in positions of religious authority, while secretly maintaining Ismaili beliefs and working to advance Nizari goals. This ability to maintain dual identities for extended periods required remarkable psychological discipline. The educational system within Nizari territories reflected their ideological priorities. Every child, regardless of social background, received basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, alongside religious education. This universal literacy, remarkable for the medieval period, served both practical and ideological purposes. Literate populations could study religious texts directly, reducing dependence on potentially unreliable intermediaries. They could also serve more effectively in administrative and military roles, maximizing the human resources of the small Nizari state. Advanced education for promising students went far beyond religious instruction. The libraries at Alamut and other major fortresses contained works on philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history from various traditions. Students learned Greek philosophy, Persian literature, and Arabic science. This broad education produced not just religious fanatics, but sophisticated thinkers capable of engaging with the full spectrum of medieval intellectual life. Many Nizari scholars made significant contributions to fields entirely unrelated to religion or politics. The role of reason in Nizari thought presents an interesting paradox. On one hand, they emphasize the insufficiency of human reason to comprehend divine truth without the Imam's guidance. On the other hand, they employed sophisticated rational arguments to defend their positions and required extensive logical training for their missionaries. This apparent contradiction was resolved through a hierarchical understanding of knowledge. Reason could demonstrate the need for divine guidance and clear away false beliefs, but ultimate truth came only through revelation properly interpreted by the Imam. The Nizari approach to other religions was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. While maintaining the superiority of their own interpretation of Islam, they recognized that earlier religions contained partial truths suited to their historical periods. Judaism and Christianity were not simply false but incomplete, containing exoteric truths that pointed toward the esoteric realities fully revealed only through the Imam. This allowed Nizari missionaries to engage respectfully with members of other faiths while still maintaining their own claims to ultimate truth. Music and ritual played important roles in Nizari religious life, though details remained scarce due to the secretive nature of their practices. Ceremonies marking initiation into higher levels of knowledge combined solemn oaths with symbolic actions representing spiritual transformation. Regular gatherings reinforced community bonds and doctrinal teachings through repetitive prayers and meditations. Some accounts suggest the use of music and rhythmic breathing to induce altered states of consciousness conducive to spiritual experience, though these practices were likely limited to advanced initiates. The question of antinomianism, whether the Nizaris believed themselves free from religious law, was a persistent accusation by their enemies. The reality was more complex. The Nizaris distinguished between the external law, which varied by historical period and was binding on the masses, and the internal truth, which was eternal and known only to the enlightened. Advanced initiates who understood the spiritual realities behind religious commandments might be released from strict adherence to external forms, but this was not license for libertine behavior. Instead, it was expected that true understanding would lead to even higher standards of ethical conduct. The economic theories implicit in Nizari practice challenged conventional Islamic approaches to wealth and property. While not communist in any modern sense, they emphasized communal ownership of major resources and mutual support among believers. Wealthy converts were expected to contribute substantially to the common treasury, while the community ensured no member lacked basic necessities. This economic egalitarianism, combined with the emphasis on universal education, created a remarkably cohesive society despite the diversity of backgrounds among converts. The role of symbolism and esoteric interpretation in Nizari thought extended beyond religious texts to encompass all of existence. Numbers held special significance, with 7 representing completion and perfection. Colors, directions, and natural phenomena all carried symbolic meanings that the initiated could read like a sacred text. This symbolic worldview transformed everyday experience into a continuous reminder of cosmic truths, reinforcing Nizari identity and beliefs through constant interpretation of the surrounding world. As Hassan-i Sabbah aged in his mountain fortress, never leaving but always present in the consciousness of his followers, the ideological system he had constructed took on a life of its own. The doctrines that had begun as revolutionary challenges to established authority became themselves a new orthodoxy within Nizari territories. The training programs that produced dais and fedayeen became institutions that would outlive their founder. The synthesis of philosophy, theology, and practical governance that characterized Nizari ideology proved remarkably durable, surviving changes in leadership and centuries of persecution. The power of ideas, carefully cultivated and strategically deployed, had created something that no merely military force could destroy. The doctrine of assassination that would make the Nizari Ismailis legendary did not emerge fully formed from Hassan-i Sabbah's strategic vision. Rather, it evolved through careful theological reasoning, practical necessity, and the accumulated experience of early operations. What began as isolated acts of self-defense gradually crystallized into a systematic approach to political violence that was unlike anything the medieval world had previously witnessed. The Nizaris did not invent political murder, but they transformed it from a tool of opportunistic violence into a precise instrument of statecraft and religious warfare. The theological justification for targeted killing required careful navigation of Islamic law and ethics. Orthodox Islam condemned both murder and suicide unequivocally, yet the Nizaris had to reconcile their methods with their claim to represent true Islam. The solution lay in reframing these acts entirely. The elimination of an enemy of the Imam was not murder, but a religious duty comparable to jihad. The fedai who died in such an operation was not committing suicide, but achieving martyrdom in defense of the faith. These were not mere semantic games, but serious theological arguments that required sophisticated philosophical reasoning to sustain. Hassan-i Sabbah personally supervised the development of this doctrinal framework during his early years at Alamut. He wrote treatises, now lost, that laid out the conditions under which killing became not just permissible, but obligatory. The target had to be actively harming the Ismaili community or preventing the establishment of divine justice. All other means of neutralizing the threat had to be impossible or ineffective. The act had to serve a clear strategic purpose beyond mere revenge. Most importantly, the fedai had to act from pure religious motivation, not personal gain or hatred. The practical development of assassination techniques proceeded alongside theological justification. Early operations were often improvised affairs, relying on opportunity and individual initiative rather than systematic planning. A fedai might spend weeks observing a target's routines, looking for moments of vulnerability. The actual attack might be a sudden rush with a dagger in a crowded marketplace or a patient wait along a lonely road. These early assassinations were effective in eliminating individual enemies, but lacked the psychological impact that would later make the Nizaris so feared. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk in October 1092 marked a turning point in both technique and impact. The Great Vizier had been the architect of Seljuk power for 3 decades, a brilliant administrator who had created the governmental structures that held the empire together. He was also a determined enemy of the Ismailis, having written theological treatises condemning their beliefs and ordered military campaigns against their strongholds. His elimination would serve multiple purposes, removing a dangerous enemy, demonstrating Nizari reach, and potentially destabilizing the Seljuk state. The operation against Nizam al-Mulk was planned for months with meticulous attention to detail. The fedai selected for the mission, Bu Tahir Arani, was chosen not just for his dedication, but for his ability to blend into the vizier's entourage. He posed as a Sufi mystic, a common sight in the courts and camps of the period. For weeks he traveled with Nizam al-Mulk's party, becoming a familiar and unthreatening presence. Guards grew accustomed to seeing him at prayers and stopped paying attention to his movements. On the chosen day, as the vizier's party traveled from Isfahan toward Baghdad, Bu Tahir approached Nizam al-Mulk's litter, under the pretense of presenting a petition. Such approaches were common, as officials often received requests from subjects during travels. The guards saw nothing unusual until Bu Tahir drew his dagger and struck. The blade found its mark before anyone could react. Bu Tahir made no attempt to escape, allowing himself to be cut down by the guards, his mission complete. The impact of Nizam al-Mulk's assassination reverberated throughout the Islamic world like an earthquake. If the mighty vizier, surrounded by guards and holding the full power of the Seljuk state, could be struck down by a single determined assassin, then no one was safe. Every emir, every general, every religious leader who had spoken against the Ismailis now wondered if they might be next. The psychological effect far exceeded the practical impact of removing one official. Fear became the Nizari's most powerful weapon. Sultan Malik Shah's death, just 35 days later, whether by poison or illness, amplified the terror. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental, even if Nizari involvement was never proven. The message appeared clear. The Nizaris could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. They could infiltrate the most secure environments, wait patiently for the perfect moment, and strike without warning. Traditional security measures seemed useless against enemies willing to die to complete their missions. The Seljuk Empire's fragmentation following these deaths provided the Nizaris with breathing space to refine their methods. Different Seljuk princes, focused on fighting each other for succession, could spare few resources to combat the Ismaili threat. Some even sought temporary accommodations with the Nizaris, offering tribute or tolerance in exchange for being removed from the target list. This period of relative peace allowed Hassan to systematize assassination doctrine and training, transforming ad hoc tactics into standardized procedures. The selection of targets became increasingly sophisticated as the Nizaris gained experience. Not every enemy was marked for death. The decision to deploy a fedai required careful calculation of costs and benefits. Training a fedai required years of investment, and each operation risked exposure of networks and methods. Targets were chosen for maximum strategic impact. Military commanders preparing campaigns against Nizari territories, religious authorities inspiring persecution of Ismaili communities, government officials implementing anti-Ismaili policies. The timing of assassinations was calibrated for psychological effect. Striking a military commander just before a planned campaign could cause the entire operation to collapse as subordinates quarreled over succession. Eliminating a religious authority during a major festival sent shockwaves through the entire religious establishment. The Nizaris learned to exploit moments of political transition or military crisis when the elimination of a single figure could trigger cascading consequences. The methods of assassination evolved from simple dagger attacks to more sophisticated approaches. While the blade remained the preferred weapon, for its symbolic and practical advantages, Nizaris also developed expertise in poisons, accidents, and other forms of elimination. A corrupt judge might die from apparently natural causes after eating a meal. A military commander might suffer a fatal fall from his horse. These varied methods kept enemies guessing and paranoid, never certain whether any death was natural or Nizari intervention. The use of disguise and infiltration reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Fedayeen learned to adopt not just the appearance but the complete persona of their cover identities. A fedai might spend years as a trusted servant, gradually gaining access to private spaces and moments of vulnerability. Others posed as merchants, establishing businesses that provided both cover and intelligence-gathering opportunities. Some infiltrated religious institutions, becoming respected scholars who could influence theological debates while identifying enemies of the Ismaili cause. The psychological warfare aspect of Nizari operations extended beyond the assassinations themselves. Sometimes the mere threat was sufficient to achieve objectives. A dagger left on an enemy's pillow with a warning note could be more effective than actual killing, forcing the target to abandon hostile policies without the costs and risks of an actual assassination. These warnings were used selectively, as empty threats would quickly lose effectiveness, but when employed, they demonstrated the Nizari's reach while offering the possibility of survival through compliance. The Nizaris developed an intelligence network that rivaled any in the medieval world. Every Ismaili community, whether in Nizari territory or living under other rulers, potentially provided information. Merchants carried news along with trade goods. Pilgrims reported on conditions in distant cities. Scholars attending theological debates identified emerging threats. This vast network allowed the Nizari leadership to track enemies, identify vulnerabilities, and coordinate operations across vast distances. Counterintelligence was equally important, as the Nizaris had to protect their own operations from exposure. They developed sophisticated codes and communication methods to prevent message interception. Cover identities were carefully constructed with supporting documentation and witnesses. Safe houses were established along major routes to shelter fedayeen traveling to or from missions. The principle of compartmentalization limited what any individual could reveal if captured, protecting the broader network from compromise. The response of targeted states to the Nizari threat revealed the effectiveness of their methods. Rulers implemented increasingly elaborate security measures that disrupted normal governance. Officials traveled with massive guard contingents that strained resources. Public appearances were restricted, limiting rulers' ability to maintain popular support. The constant fear of assassination created paranoia that poisoned relationships and paralyzed decision-making. The Nizaris had discovered that the threat of violence could be as powerful as violence itself. Some rulers attempted to adopt Nizari methods, training their own assassins to strike back. These efforts generally failed because they lacked the ideological foundation that made Nizari operations effective. Mercenary assassins motivated by gold could never match the dedication of fedayeen motivated by faith. Moreover, the Nizari leadership operated from impregnable mountain fortresses, making retaliatory assassination extremely difficult. The asymmetry that favored the Nizaris in conventional warfare applied equally to the shadow war of assassination. The ethical implications of the assassination doctrine troubled even some within the Nizari community. Taking life, even in service of divine justice, carried spiritual weight. The fedayeen underwent elaborate purification rituals before and after operations, seeking to maintain spiritual purity despite their violent acts. The community developed commemorative practices to honor fedayeen who died in service, transforming them from killers into martyrs whose sacrifice advanced the coming of divine justice. The question of collective punishment arose when operations resulted in retaliation against Ismaili communities. Sometimes the elimination of a persecuting official led to even harsher persecution by his successors. The Nizari leadership had to balance the benefits of removing enemies against the potential costs to vulnerable communities. This calculation became increasingly complex as Ismaili populations spread and grew, creating more potential targets for retaliation. The role of women in assassination operations remains historically unclear but intriguing. While no confirmed accounts exist of female fedayeen, women certainly participated in intelligence gathering and support operations. The ability of women to access spaces forbidden to men, particularly domestic areas where rulers were most vulnerable, would have provided significant advantages. Some historians speculate that the absence of records about female assassins might reflect successful operations that were never detected rather than their non-existence. The economic dimension of the assassination program is often overlooked, but was crucial to its sustainability. Each operation required substantial investment in training, preparation, and support. The costs included not just the years of training for each fedai, but maintaining cover identities, safe houses, and intelligence networks. The Nizari state's limited resources meant that each operation had to be justified in strategic terms. This economic constraint prevented the assassination program from devolving into indiscriminate terrorism. The cultural impact of Nizari assassinations extended far beyond their immediate political effect. The figure of the hidden assassin entered folklore and literature throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Stories of their dedication, disguises, and sudden strikes became legendary, often embellished far beyond historical reality. These tales served Nizari purposes by magnifying their reputation and thus their deterrent effect, but they also contributed to the demonization that would justify later persecution. The success of the assassination program in achieving strategic objectives varied considerably. While individual operations might succeed brilliantly, the broader goal of establishing security for Ismaili communities remained elusive. Each successful assassination might deter some enemies but motivate others. The Nizari state survived and sometimes thrived, but it never achieved the transformation of the Islamic world that Hassan-i Sabbah had envisioned. The assassination doctrine proved effective as a defensive tool, but limited as an offensive strategy. The refinement of assassination techniques continued throughout Hassan's lifetime and beyond. Later operations showed increasing sophistication in planning, execution, and exploitation of results. The Nizaris learned to coordinate multiple simultaneous operations for maximum psychological impact. They developed contingency plans for failed attempts. They created deception operations to misdirect retaliation. The assassination doctrine evolved from desperate improvisation to military science. The theological debates within the Nizari community about assassination continued long after the doctrine was established. Some scholars argued for expanding targets to include economic and cultural figures who indirectly supported anti-Ismaili policies. Others advocated for more restrictive criteria, limiting operations to direct military threats. These debates reflected deeper questions about the relationship between religious ends and violent means that would resonate through centuries of political and religious conflict. The documentation of assassination operations was deliberately limited to protect operational security. Most records were destroyed to prevent enemy intelligence from understanding Nizari methods. This destruction of evidence has frustrated historians but was essential to the program's success. The mystery surrounding Nizari operations enhanced their psychological impact while protecting ongoing operations. Even today, much about their specific techniques and operations remains unknown. As the 12th century progressed, the assassination doctrine had become inseparable from Nizari identity. What had begun as a tactical necessity had evolved into a defining characteristic that shaped how the Nizaris saw themselves and how others saw them. The fedayeen were not just warriors but symbols of absolute dedication to divine cause. The assassination program was not just a military strategy, but a theological statement about the nature of divine justice and human agency. The Nizaris had created something unprecedented, a systematic approach to political violence grounded in religious conviction and refined through practical experience. The morning call to prayer at Alamut echoed differently than in the mosques of Cairo or Baghdad. Here, at an elevation where clouds often drifted below the fortress walls, the sound seemed to rise directly toward heaven, unimpeded by the crowded streets and competing noises of lowland cities. The residents who responded to this call were not typical medieval Muslims, but members of a unique community that had transformed an imposing mountain fortress into something unprecedented, a center of learning and spiritual development that functioned simultaneously as the heart of a revolutionary state. Life within Alamut's walls followed rhythms dictated by both practical necessity and spiritual purpose. The day began before dawn with ablutions performed with water carefully conserved from cisterns carved into living rock. The scarcity of water at such altitude made every drop precious, leading to innovations in conservation that would have seemed extreme in river valleys but were essential for mountain survival. The morning prayers were communal, reinforcing the bonds that held this diverse community together, despite differences in origin, language, and social background. After prayers came the first meal, simple but nutritious, consisting primarily of bread baked from grain grown in the valley below, dried fruits from the fortress gardens, and dairy products from the goats and sheep that grazed on mountain slopes. The Nizaris had learned to maximize nutrition from limited resources, developing preservation techniques that allowed food, stored during harvest, to sustain the community through long winters when the fortress might be isolated by snow for months. Every resident, from the highest administrator to the youngest student, ate the same basic fare, reinforcing the egalitarian principles that distinguished Nizari society. The legendary gardens of Alamut were not the fantasy paradises described by hostile chroniclers, but something more remarkable: functional agricultural spaces that combined productivity with beauty in ways that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible at such altitudes. Hassan-i Sabbah himself had overseen their initial design, applying the same systematic thinking to horticulture that he brought to theology and military strategy. The gardens occupied every available space where soil could be accumulated and water channeled, creating green oases among the grey stone of the fortress. These gardens served multiple purposes beyond food production. Medicinal herbs were cultivated with particular care, as the fortress needed to be self-sufficient in medical treatment. The Nizaris developed extensive knowledge of mountain plants and their properties, creating pharmacopoeias that documented remedies unknown to lowland physicians. Some plants were grown for their psychological effects, used in meditation practices or to treat melancholy during the long winter months of isolation. The persistent legends about drugs used to manipulate fedayeen might have originated from glimpses of these medicinal gardens, their true purpose distorted by imagination and prejudice. The aesthetic dimension of the gardens should not be overlooked simply because they were functional. The Nizaris understood that beauty nourished the spirit as surely as food nourished the body. Flowering plants were integrated among vegetables and herbs, creating spaces where residents could find moments of contemplation and peace. Small fountains, fed by carefully channeled mountain streams, provided the sound of running water that carried profound symbolic meaning in Islamic culture. These gardens represented not just survival, but the possibility of creating paradise on earth through human effort and divine guidance. The library at Alamut was perhaps Hassan-i Sabbah's greatest creation after the Nizari state itself. Beginning with his personal collection of texts accumulated over decades of travel and study, it had grown to rival any collection in the Islamic world. The library occupied several chambers carved into the mountain, providing stable temperatures and protection from the moisture that would have destroyed precious manuscripts. The collection was organized according to a classification system that Hassan had developed, dividing knowledge into categories that reflected both traditional Islamic scholarship and Nizari theological innovations. The breadth of the collection was extraordinary for a mountain fortress. Religious texts naturally dominated, including not just various recensions of the Quran and Hadith collections, but commentaries representing every major school of Islamic thought. The Ismaili texts were particularly comprehensive, preserving works that existed nowhere else, including writings from the early Fatimid period that had been suppressed or destroyed elsewhere. Yet religion was only one dimension of the collection. Works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, alchemy, and philosophy filled entire sections. The presence of texts from non-Islamic traditions reflected the Nizari belief that truth could be found in many sources. Greek philosophical works translated during the Abbasid period were studied alongside Persian wisdom literature and Indian mathematical treatises. Hebrew texts on mysticism and Christian theological works were available for scholars engaged in comparative religious studies. This intellectual openness, remarkable for the medieval period, stemmed from the Ismaili conviction that all religions contained partial truths pointing toward the ultimate reality that would be fully revealed only with the return of the Imam. The library was not a static repository, but a living center of scholarship. Scribes worked continuously to copy deteriorating manuscripts and produce new copies for distribution to other Nizari fortresses. Translators rendered important works from various languages into Persian and Arabic, making them accessible to the community. Original works were being composed constantly, from theological treatises to scientific observations of celestial phenomena visible from Alamut's high altitude. The library functioned as both preserver of past knowledge and generator of new understanding. Access to the library was remarkably democratic by medieval standards. While certain esoteric texts were restricted to advanced initiates, the general collection was open to any resident who could read. Children learned their letters by copying passages from simpler texts, gradually working their way toward more complex works. Women had the same access as men, though they used the library at different hours to maintain propriety. This broad access to knowledge created a community where intellectual discussion could occur at all levels, from philosophical debates among scholars to practical discussions among craftsmen consulting technical manuals. The scientific activities at Alamut went far beyond what might be expected from a military fortress. The clear mountain air and minimal light interference made it an ideal location for astronomical observation. The Nizaris constructed observation platforms and installed instruments for tracking celestial movements. Their astronomers made precise observations that contributed to the refinement of astronomical tables used throughout the Islamic world. The work had practical applications in determining prayer times and religious festivals, but it also reflected a deeper belief that understanding the heavens brought one closer to understanding divine order. Mathematical studies at Alamut were similarly advanced. Nizari scholars worked on problems of algebra and geometry that had practical applications in engineering and theoretical implications for understanding the nature of reality. They were particularly interested in the mathematical relationships underlying natural phenomena, seeing in mathematical harmony evidence of divine design. Some of their work on number theory related to their theological concepts, particularly the significance of 7 in Ismaili cosmology, but much was pure mathematical investigation driven by intellectual curiosity. Medical practice at Alamut combined traditional Islamic medicine with innovations necessitated by the mountain environment. Physicians studied the works of great medical authorities like Ibn Sina while developing treatments for conditions specific to high-altitude living. They documented the effects of thin air on human physiology, treatments for injuries from falls on rocky terrain, and remedies for the respiratory ailments common in cold, dry mountain air. The isolation of the fortress led to innovations in surgery and treatment of traumatic injuries, as patients could not be easily transferred to specialized medical centers. The experimental approach to agriculture in the Alamut Valley represented some of the most innovative work undertaken by the Nizaris. The short growing season, limited arable land, and extreme weather conditions required constant innovation. They developed new varieties of barley and other grains adapted to high altitude, selecting and breeding for cold resistance and rapid maturation. Irrigation systems were engineered with remarkable precision, using underground channels to prevent evaporation and freezing. Terracing techniques maximized usable land while preventing erosion during spring snowmelt. The social structure within Alamut reflected Nizari ideological principles while accommodating practical necessities. The community was organized hierarchically, but the hierarchy was based on spiritual advancement and functional expertise rather than birth or wealth. A brilliant scholar from a peasant background could rise to positions of authority, while the children of important officials started their education alongside everyone else. This meritocratic system, unusual for the medieval period, created social mobility that motivated achievement while maintaining stability. The daily routine of the fortress was precisely regulated, with specific times allocated for prayer, study, work, and rest. The schedule varied by season, with longer work periods during summer, when agricultural activities demanded attention, and more time devoted to study during winter months. Everyone had assigned responsibilities, from maintenance of water systems to instruction of children. This universal participation in communal work reinforced the sense that all residents were engaged in a shared sacred mission, rather than simply living under the protection of a military elite. Education began early for children at Alamut, with both boys and girls attending classes from age 5 or 6. The curriculum started with basic literacy and numeracy, taught through memorization of Quranic verses and simple mathematical problems. As children progressed, subjects expanded to include history, geography, and natural philosophy. The pedagogical methods were surprisingly progressive, emphasizing understanding over rote memorization and encouraging questions and discussion. Teachers were trained to identify particular talents and interests, directing students towards specialized studies that matched their aptitudes. The education of girls was particularly remarkable for the medieval Islamic world. While they were not trained for military roles, girls received the same basic education as boys and could pursue advanced studies in most fields. Many became scholars, physicians, and administrators within the Nizari community. Some accounts suggest that Hassan-i Sabbah's own daughters were accomplished scholars who contributed to theological debates and scientific investigations. This relative gender equality was partly pragmatic, maximizing human resources in a small community, but also reflected theological principles about the spiritual equality of all souls. Physical training was integrated into daily life for all residents, not just potential fedayeen. The mountain environment itself demanded physical fitness, but organized exercise went beyond mere necessity. Climbing exercises prepared residents for emergency evacuations or defensive actions. Breathing exercises, possibly influenced by Sufi or Indian yogic practices, helped adaptation to thin air and served meditative purposes. Wrestling and other martial activities provided entertainment while maintaining military readiness. Even scholars and craftsmen participated in physical training, reinforcing the ideal of balanced development of mind, body, and spirit. The craft workshops at Alamut produced goods essential for the fortress's self-sufficiency. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons using techniques adapted for the limited fuel available at high altitude. Weavers produced cloth from wool sheared from mountain sheep, creating garments suited to the harsh climate. Leather workers processed hides into everything from bookbindings to water containers. These craftsmen were not mere laborers, but respected members of the community whose skills were essential for survival. They had access to technical manuscripts in the library and were encouraged to innovate and improve traditional techniques. The economic life of Alamut operated on principles that differed from both feudal and commercial systems prevalent elsewhere. While private property existed for personal items, major resources were communally owned and managed. Workshops, libraries, and agricultural facilities belonged to the community as a whole. Distribution of goods followed need rather than market principles, with communal stores ensuring everyone had adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Surplus production was traded with valley communities or stored for emergencies rather than accumulated as private wealth. The architectural evolution of Alamut during Hassan's residence reflected both practical needs and spiritual symbolism. New constructions were integrated seamlessly with natural rock formations, creating spaces that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Underground chambers were expanded for storage and shelter, connected by passages that provided protection during sieges, yet attention was also paid to creating spaces for contemplation and community gathering. Prayer halls were oriented precisely toward Mecca and designed with acoustic properties that amplified the human voice. Common areas encouraged informal interaction that built community bonds. Water management at Alamut represented a triumph of engineering adapted to extreme conditions. The system collected water from multiple sources including rainfall, snowmelt, and mountain springs. Stone channels carved with precise gradients carried water to storage cisterns without mechanical pumping. These cisterns, lined with hydraulic cement that prevented seepage, could store enough water to sustain the fortress through extended sieges. The distribution system ensured equitable access while prioritizing essential uses during shortages. Overflow from fountains and ablution areas was channeled to gardens, wasting nothing. The communication systems linking Alamut with other Nizari fortresses were sophisticated for the medieval period. Beyond human messengers, the Nizaris employed carrier pigeons trained to fly between specific fortresses. Signal fires and mirror systems allowed rapid transmission of simple messages across mountain valleys. Written communications used codes and ciphers that protected sensitive information if messages were intercepted. This network allowed coordination of activities across the entire Nizari state, despite the distances and difficult terrain separating different communities. The religious life at Alamut went beyond the 5 daily prayers required of all Muslims. Regular lectures on theological topics allowed community members to deepen their understanding of Ismaili doctrine. Meditation sessions, possibly influenced by Sufi practices, helped develop spiritual awareness. Special ceremonies marked important events in the Ismaili calendar, reinforcing communal identity and shared purpose. The observation of these rituals was not compulsory in the way Orthodox Islam demanded, reflecting the Nizari belief that genuine faith could not be forced but must arise from understanding and conviction. Food preparation and communal meals served social as well as nutritional functions. The kitchen facilities were extensive, capable of feeding the entire community simultaneously during special occasions. Meals were opportunities for informal education, with senior members sharing knowledge and experience with younger residents. The simple diet was occasionally supplemented with special dishes during festivals, but luxury and excess were actively discouraged. Hassan himself was known for his austere habits, eating the same simple meals as the lowest-ranking residents and wearing plain clothing that distinguished him only by its cleanliness. The treatment of illness and injury at Alamut combined scientific medicine with spiritual healing. The fortress maintained an infirmary staffed by trained physicians who could perform complex procedures, including surgery. Medicinal preparations were produced from plants grown in the gardens and minerals obtained from the mountains. Yet treatment also incorporated prayers and spiritual counseling, recognizing the connection between mental and physical health. The mortality rate at Alamut was reportedly lower than in many lowland cities, possibly due to the clean mountain air, regulated diet, and comprehensive health care. The management of information within Alamut balanced transparency with security. General announcements were made at communal gatherings, ensuring all residents stayed informed about important matters. Educational materials were freely available to those qualified to understand them. Yet sensitive information about military operations, intelligence activities, and certain theological mysteries was strictly compartmentalized. This balance maintained community cohesion while protecting operational security, creating a society that was simultaneously open and secretive. As Hassan-i Sabbah aged in his mountain sanctuary, never leaving but always present through his decisions and teachings, the life he had created at Alamut had become a functioning reality that challenged conventional assumptions about what was possible. Here was a community that combined military preparedness with scholarly pursuits, religious devotion with scientific investigation, austere discipline with intellectual freedom. The residents of Alamut were not the drug-addled fanatics of hostile imagination, but members of a sophisticated society attempting to create a new form of human organization based on principles of spiritual advancement, intellectual achievement, and communal solidarity. The daily life of this mountain community, in its complexity and contradictions, represented one of the most interesting social experiments of the medieval world. The death of Hassan-i Sabbah on May 23, 1124, marked not the end, but a transformation of the Nizari Ismaili state. For 34 years, he had been the hidden center around which the entire movement revolved, never leaving Alamut, yet present in every decision, every doctrine, every operation undertaken in the name of the concealed imam. His passing might have shattered a movement so dependent on a single charismatic leader, yet Hassan had prepared for this moment with the same methodical planning he brought to every aspect of Nizari development. The succession that followed would prove his organizational genius extended beyond his own mortality. In his final years, Hassan had grown increasingly austere, spending most of his time in prayer, study, and writing. He ate barely enough to sustain life and slept only a few hours each night. Visitors who were granted rare audiences described a figure who seemed already partially removed from the physical world, his voice soft but commanding, his eyes burning with an intensity that belonged more to spirit than flesh. He had executed his own sons, one for drinking wine and another on suspicion of plotting murder, demonstrating that even family bonds meant nothing compared to the purity of the mission. This terrible sacrifice had cleared the path for a succession based on merit rather than blood. Kia Buzurg Umid, who Hassan designated as his successor, represented continuity rather than change. He had been one of Hassan's earliest and most trusted companions, present at the capture of Alamut and instrumental in developing the administrative structures of the Nizari state. His name, meaning Great Hope, reflected the expectations placed upon him to maintain the movement's momentum after its founder's death. Unlike Hassan, who had been a brilliant innovator and visionary, Kia Buzurg Umid was an administrator and consolidator, exactly what the movement needed at this crucial transition. The transfer of authority proceeded smoothly, testament to the institutional structures Hassan had created. There was no succession crisis, no competing claims to leadership, no fracturing of the movement into rival factions. Kia Buzurg Umid assumed the title of Da'i, chief missionary, rather than claiming any higher spiritual authority. He presented himself as the guardian of Hassan's legacy rather than his replacement, maintaining the theological position that ultimate authority remained with the concealed imam. This humility helped preserve unity while avoiding theological controversies about the nature of leadership. Under Kia Buzurg Umid's leadership, which lasted until his death in 1138, the Nizari state entered a period of measured expansion and internal development. Rather than launching dramatic new initiatives, he focused on strengthening what already existed. Additional fortresses were acquired through the patient methods Hassan had perfected, with conversion preceding conquest. The network of fortresses expanded from the Elburz mountains into other ranges, creating a discontinuous but strategically connected territory that frustrated enemies attempting to treat it as a conventional state. The Syrian extension of Nizari power, which would become nearly as important as the Persian centers, developed significantly during this period. The fragmented political landscape of Syria, divided among various Muslim princes and increasingly pressured by Crusader states, provided opportunities for Nizari expansion. Syrian Ismailis, who had maintained underground networks since Fatimid times, began acquiring fortresses in the Jabal Ansariya mountains. These Syrian positions would eventually operate with considerable autonomy while maintaining spiritual allegiance to Alamut. The relationship between the Persian and Syrian branches reflected the flexible organizational structure that allowed the Nizari state to function despite geographical separation. Communication between Alamut and Syrian fortresses took weeks or months, making centralized control of daily operations impossible. Instead, the Syrian Nizaris operated under broad strategic guidance from Alamut while adapting tactics to local conditions. This combination of unified purpose and operational flexibility would prove essential for survival in the complex political environment of the Crusader period. Kia Buzurg Umid also had to navigate the changing dynamics of Seljuk power. The great empire that had threatened to crush the early Nizari state had fragmented into competing principalities after Malik Shah's death. Different Seljuk princes controlled various regions, sometimes fighting each other more vigorously than they fought external enemies. This fragmentation provided opportunities for the Nizaris to play different factions against each other, offering support to one prince against another in exchange for tolerance or even alliance. The economic development of Nizari territories accelerated during this period of relative stability. With less pressure from external military threats, resources could be directed toward infrastructure improvements. Irrigation systems were expanded, bringing more land under cultivation. Trade routes through Nizari territories were secured and regulated, generating customs revenues. The famous Alamut Library grew substantially, attracting scholars who contributed to its collections while pursuing their own research. This economic and intellectual development strengthened the Nizari state's ability to sustain itself independently. The theological evolution of Nizari doctrine continued under Kia Buzurg Umid, though without the revolutionary innovations of Hassan's period. Scholars at Alamut worked to systematize and clarify the teachings Hassan had developed, creating comprehensive theological texts that could guide missionaries and educate new converts. The relationship between external religious law and internal spiritual truth was elaborated in greater detail. The nature of the Imam's concealment and the conditions for his return were subjects of extensive speculation and debate. When Kia Buzurg Umid died in February 1138, the succession again proceeded smoothly. His son Muhammad I assumed leadership, marking the first hereditary succession in the Nizari state. This might have seemed a departure from Hassan's merit-based principles, but Muhammad had proven himself capable during his father's lifetime, and his succession was accepted without opposition. His 24-year rule would see both the consolidation of Nizari power and the emergence of new challenges that would test the movement's adaptability. Muhammad I inherited a state that was more secure and prosperous than at any time since its founding. The network of fortresses was extensive and well supplied. The population in Nizari territories was growing, with second and third generation Nizaris who had known no other system. The threatening powers that had seemed overwhelming in Hassan's time were now manageable challenges rather than existential threats. This relative security allowed Muhammad to consider possibilities that would have been unthinkable during the struggle for survival. The most significant development during Muhammad's rule was the increased interaction with the broader Islamic world. While maintaining their distinctive beliefs and practices, the Nizaris under Muhammad began to engage more openly with other Muslim communities. Trade relationships expanded beyond basic necessities to include luxury goods and scholarly exchanges. Nizari scholars attended debates in major cities, defending their positions with sophisticated arguments rather than hiding their affiliations. This opening was calculated and limited, but it marked a shift from pure isolation toward selective engagement. The Syrian branch of the Nizaris achieved particular prominence during Muhammad's period under the leadership of Rashid ad-Din Sinan, who would become known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan, appointed by Alamut but operating with considerable independence, transformed the Syrian Nizaris from a persecuted minority into a significant regional power. His long leadership from 1163 to 1193 would see the Syrian Nizaris navigate the complex dynamics of the Crusades while maintaining their distinctive identity and mission. Sinan's background prepared him perfectly for leadership in the complex Syrian environment. Born in Basra and educated at Alamut, he combined deep theological knowledge with practical political skills. His appointment to Syria came at a crucial moment when the Nizari communities there needed strong leadership to survive between the pressures of Crusader expansion and Muslim counter-crusades. Sinan proved capable of playing all sides while serving Nizari interests, negotiating with Crusaders, Ayyubids, and other Muslim powers as circumstances required. The Syrian fortresses under Sinan's control became legendary among both Muslims and Christians. Masyaf, the most famous, served as Sinan's primary residence and the effective capital of Syrian Nizari territories. Like Alamut, these fortresses combined defensive strength with surprising cultural sophistication. Libraries, albeit smaller than Alamut's, preserved important texts. Gardens provided both food and beauty. The communities that developed around these fortresses created islands of Nizari culture in the tumultuous sea of Syrian politics. The relationship between Sinan and the leadership at Alamut was complex and sometimes tense. While acknowledging spiritual allegiance to the Imam's representatives in Persia, Sinan operated with remarkable autonomy. Some accounts suggest he even claimed independent spiritual authority at certain points, though he never formally broke with Alamut. This tension reflected the practical difficulties of maintaining unity across vast distances and the different challenges faced by Persian and Syrian Nizaris. The assassination operations conducted by Syrian Nizaris under Sinan achieved particular notoriety. The attempted assassinations of Saladin, the great Muslim leader, who was fighting both Crusaders and rival Muslims, demonstrated Nizari reach even into the most protected environments. While these attempts ultimately failed, they forced Saladin to divert resources to personal protection and to eventually reach an accommodation with the Nizaris. The message was clear: even the most powerful rulers could not afford to ignore Nizari interests. The Syrian Nizaris also conducted operations against Crusader leaders when circumstances warranted. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192, just days after he was elected King of Jerusalem, showed that Christian rulers were no safer than Muslim ones from Nizari reach. Yet Sinan was equally willing to negotiate with Crusaders when it served Nizari interests, even reportedly considering conversion to Christianity as a diplomatic maneuver, though this was likely more political theatre than genuine religious interest. Back in Persia, Muhammad I faced different challenges from those confronting Sinan in Syria. The fragmented Seljuk successors were gradually being replaced by new powers, particularly the Khwarezmian dynasty that was expanding from Central Asia. These new threats required careful diplomacy and occasional demonstrations of Nizari power through targeted assassinations. Muhammad proved adept at maintaining the balance of power that allowed the Nizari state to survive among stronger neighbors. The internal development of Nizari society continued during Muhammad's rule. The educational system expanded, with new schools established in major fortresses. The curriculum broadened to include more practical subjects alongside religious instruction. Engineers were trained to maintain and improve the complex water and agricultural systems. Physicians studied both traditional medicine and new techniques developed through practical experience. This investment in human capital ensured the Nizari state could maintain its independence despite limited material resources. The role of women in Nizari society during this period appears to have been remarkably progressive, though sources are limited. Women not only received education, but participated in scholarly debates and contributed to intellectual life. Some accounts suggest women served as teachers and physicians within Nizari communities. While they did not participate in military operations, women managed agricultural production and craft workshops when men were called to defensive duties. This practical equality, born of necessity in small communities, distinguished Nizari society from contemporary Muslim societies. The economic strategies employed during Muhammad's leadership showed increasing sophistication. Rather than relying solely on agricultural production and transit taxes, the Nizaris developed specialized products for trade. Their metal workers produced high-quality steel using techniques that remained secret. Their physicians developed medicines from mountain plants that were sought after in urban markets. Their scribes produced beautiful manuscript copies that were valued by collectors. This economic diversification reduced vulnerability to agricultural failures or trade disruptions. The theological developments during Muhammad's rule prepared the ground for dramatic changes that would come under his successor. Questions about the nature of the imamate and the meaning of its concealment were debated with increasing intensity. Some scholars argued that the period of concealment was ending, that signs indicated the imminent return or manifestation of the imam. Others maintained that the concealment would continue indefinitely, requiring continued patience and struggle. These debates, seemingly abstract, had profound implications for how the Nizari state understood its mission and future. The military capabilities of the Nizari state evolved during this period from purely defensive to limited offensive operations. While still unable to face conventional armies in open battle, Nizari forces became capable of rapid strikes against vulnerable targets. Raids on enemy supply lines, surprise attacks on isolated garrisons, and coordinated operations with Allied forces showed growing tactical sophistication. The fedayeen remained the most feared element of Nizari power, but they were now part of a more comprehensive military structure. The diplomatic relationships maintained by Muhammad the Firm extended beyond the Islamic world. Accounts suggest contact with Byzantine Christians, Indian kingdoms, and even distant Chinese authorities along the Silk Road. These connections were primarily commercial, but they also served intelligence purposes and provided diplomatic alternatives when regional pressures became intense. The Nizaris were developing an understanding of their place in a broader world system, rather than seeing themselves as isolated mountain communities. The cultural production of the Nizari state during this middle period deserves recognition. While most texts were destroyed in later conquests, surviving fragments suggest a rich literary tradition. Poetry was composed celebrating both spiritual themes and the natural beauty of mountain landscapes. Historical chronicles documented the development of the Nizari movement with attention to detail that would have been valuable for modern historians. Scientific treatises recorded observations and experiments that contributed to broader Islamic scientific traditions. The succession crisis that followed Muhammad I's death in 1162 would transform the Nizari movement in unexpected ways. His son Hassan II would claim to be the Imam himself, ending the period of concealment and initiating what he called the Qiyamah, the resurrection. This radical departure from established doctrine would have been unthinkable under Hassan-i Sabbah or his immediate successors. Yet the institutional structures and ideological flexibility developed during the reigns of Kia Buzurgumid and Muhammad Thaig made such transformation possible without destroying the movement. The period between Hassan-i Sabbah's death and the declaration of the Qiyamah represented a crucial middle phase in Nizari history. The movement had evolved from a revolutionary insurgency to an established state, from a persecuted minority to a regional power, from rigid ideological purity to pragmatic political engagement. The leaders of this period, less dramatic than Hassan-i Sabbah or as controversial as later imams, had provided the stability and development that allowed the Nizari experiment to continue. Their contributions, often overlooked in histories focused on more dramatic moments, had been essential for the survival and evolution of one of history's most unusual political entities. The Syrian branch under Sinan would continue to operate with increasing independence, becoming almost a separate entity while maintaining nominal allegiance to Alamut. The Persian fortresses would face new challenges from emerging powers. The theological innovations of Hassan II would create internal controversies that threatened the unity Hassan-i Sabbah had so carefully constructed. Yet the foundations laid during this middle period, the institutions developed, the networks established, and the traditions maintained would allow the Nizari Ismailis to survive challenges that would have destroyed a less resilient movement. The transformation from Hassan's revolutionary vision to sustainable reality was complete, setting the stage for new transformations that would test the adaptability of the Nizari system. The figure emerged from morning mist like something from a dream, white-bearded and wearing simple robes, standing at the gates of Masyaf fortress, as if he had materialized from the mountain itself. The Crusader envoys who had come to negotiate with Rashid ad-Din Sinan in 1173 would later describe feeling they were entering not just a fortress, but another world, where the normal rules of power and politics seemed suspended. They had come seeking alliance, or at least neutrality, from the man they called the Old Man of the Mountain, a figure who had already begun to transcend history and enter legend. The origins of this peculiar title revealed the layers of misunderstanding and translation that would characterize European encounters with the Nizaris. The Arabic title Sheikh al-Jabal, meaning elder or chief of the mountain, was translated literally into Old Man of the Mountain by Crusader chroniclers who missed the respect implicit in the original. Yet this mistranslation captured something essential about how Europeans perceived Sinan and his successors, ancient, mysterious figures wielding incomprehensible power from inaccessible mountain strongholds. The title would outlive the men who bore it, becoming a symbol of Oriental mystery and danger in Western imagination. Rashid ad-Din Sinan had cultivated this aura of mystery deliberately, understanding that reputation could be as powerful as any fortress or army. Born in Iraq around 1132, he had spent years studying at Alamut before being appointed to lead the Syrian Nizaris. Unlike his predecessors who had struggled simply to survive, Sinan transformed the Syrian Ismailis into a power that neither Crusaders nor Muslim rulers could ignore. His method combined genuine military capability with psychological warfare that played on the fears and imaginations of his enemies. The stories that circulated about Sinan among both Crusaders and Muslims grew more fantastic with each telling. It was said he could read minds, appear in multiple places simultaneously, and command absolute obedience from followers who would leap from fortress walls at his slightest gesture. Some claimed he possessed magical powers derived from ancient books of wisdom, others that he communed with jinn who revealed secrets of his enemies. These tales, while obviously exaggerated, served Sinan's purposes perfectly, making him seem more than human and therefore impossible to defeat through conventional means. The reality of Sinan's power, while less magical, was nonetheless remarkable. He commanded perhaps 2,000 dedicated fedayeen and controlled a network of 8 major fortresses in the Jabal Ansariya mountains. His intelligence network extended throughout Syria and beyond, providing information about political developments, military movements, and personal vulnerabilities of potential enemies. His diplomatic skills allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of Crusader-era politics, maintaining independence, while surrounded by powers that could theoretically crush him. The Crusaders first encountered the Nizaris not as enemies, but as potential allies against their common Muslim opponents. The complex political geometry of the Crusader states meant that yesterday's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and religious differences were often subordinated to practical considerations. The Nizaris, as a minority persecuted by Sunni rulers, had reasons to cooperate with Christians against their Muslim oppressors. This potential for alliance would lead to some of the most unusual diplomatic exchanges of the medieval period. The first significant interaction came in 1126 when the Nizaris paid tribute to the Kingdom of Jerusalem for temporary control of the fortress of Banias. This pragmatic arrangement demonstrated that the Nizaris could work with Christians when it served their interests. As the Crusader states established themselves along the Levantine coast, they found the Nizaris useful as a buffer against Muslim powers and as a source of intelligence about Muslim courts where Ismaili agents operated. The relationship reached its most intriguing point in the 1170s when Sinan allegedly sent envoys to King Amalric I of Jerusalem proposing that the Syrian Nizaris convert to Christianity. The proposal, if genuine, was likely a diplomatic maneuver rather than serious religious interest, aimed at securing alliance against mutual enemies. The negotiations reportedly foundered when Templar knights murdered the Nizari envoys, either from religious zealotry or because they feared losing tribute payments from Nizari communities. The incident revealed the complex tensions within the Crusader camp about how to relate to the mysterious mountain sect. The most famous encounters between Sinan and the powers of his time involved Saladin, the great Kurdish leader who united Muslim resistance to the Crusades. Saladin represented everything the Nizaris opposed: Sunni orthodoxy, political centralization, and suppression of religious minorities. As Saladin consolidated power in Syria and Egypt, conflict with the Nizaris became inevitable. The resulting confrontation would demonstrate both the reach of Nizari power and its limitations. The first attempted assassination of Saladin occurred in 1174 when fedayeen infiltrated his camp near Aleppo. Disguised as soldiers in his own army, they waited until Saladin was reviewing troops before striking. Only the alertness of a bodyguard who noticed something suspicious about their behavior prevented them from reaching their target. The assassins were killed, but the message was clear. Saladin's life was in constant danger as long as he threatened Nizari interests. A second attempt in 1176 came even closer to success. Fedayeen had infiltrated Saladin's inner circle, with one reportedly serving as a trusted servant for months. During a siege, they attacked Saladin in his tent, and only his armor saved him from a fatal blow. The psychological impact was devastating. Saladin, who had seemed invincible in his victories against Crusaders and Muslim rivals, was reduced to sleeping in a wooden tower specially constructed for protection, checking his food for poison and trusting no one completely. The resolution of the conflict between Saladin and Sinan demonstrated the pragmatic nature of medieval politics. Rather than continue the costly vendetta, both leaders recognized the benefits of accommodation. Saladin withdrew his forces from Nizari territories and ceased persecution of Ismaili communities. In return, Sinan ended assassination attempts and may have even provided intelligence about Saladin's enemies. This understanding allowed both leaders to focus on what they considered more important goals: Saladin's jihad against the Crusaders and Sinan's preservation of Nizari independence. The assassination that most captured European imagination was the killing of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192. Conrad had just been selected as King of Jerusalem and seemed poised to unite the fractious Crusader states when two fedayeen, disguised as Christian monks, struck him down in the streets of Tyre. The killing shocked the Crusader world and launched countless conspiracy theories. Some blamed Sinan, acting on his own initiative or in alliance with Saladin. Others suspected Richard the Lionheart of England, Conrad's rival, of hiring the assassins. Still others saw the hand of Henry of Champagne, who married Conrad's widow with suspicious haste. The truth remains uncertain, but the impact was clear. The assassins had demonstrated they could strike anywhere, even in the heart of a Christian city, even against the most protected targets. The image of the killer monks, patient and deadly, entered European folklore. The message to Crusader leaders was unmistakable. The old man of the mountain's reach extended everywhere, and no one who threatened Nizari interests was safe. The accounts of European travelers and chroniclers transformed the historical Nizaris into something barely recognizable. William of Tyre, the most reliable Crusader historian, provided relatively accurate descriptions of Nizari beliefs and practices, but his account was soon overshadowed by more sensational versions. The legend of the Paradise Gardens, where drugged young men were given a foretaste of heavenly rewards, first appeared in these Crusader accounts, despite no evidence such practices actually existed. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling. The old man of the mountain became a sorcerer who controlled his followers through magic and drugs. The fedayeen became mindless automatons who killed without question or hesitation. The mountain fortresses became enchanted castles where reality itself could be manipulated. These tales said more about European fears and fascinations than about actual Nizari practices, but they would shape Western perceptions of the Islamic world for centuries. Marco Polo's account, written decades after his alleged travels through Persia in the 1270s, presented the most influential version of the assassin legend. Polo described elaborate gardens designed to resemble paradise, complete with flowing streams of wine, honey, and milk. Young men would be drugged with hashish, brought to these gardens and allowed to enjoy every pleasure before being drugged again and removed. Told they had experienced paradise, they would then gladly die to return there permanently. Polo's narrative was compelling but historically problematic. He claimed to have visited Alamut years after it had been destroyed by the Mongols, describing flourishing gardens in ruins. His account borrowed heavily from earlier legends and contained geographical errors, suggesting he never actually visited the sites he described. Yet his version became definitive in European imagination, repeated and embellished by countless later authors who had even less connection to historical reality. The etymology of the word assassin itself became a subject of speculation and myth-making. The most popular theory derived it from hashishin, supposedly meaning hashish users, supporting the drug use narrative. More likely, it derived from Hassassin, followers of Hassan-i Sabbah, or from Asasiyun, meaning people of the foundation or fundamental principles. But the hashish etymology proved too attractive to abandon, fitting perfectly with European ideas about Oriental decadence and irrationality. The Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders who controlled many Crusader fortresses, had the most sustained contact with the Nizaris. These interactions were primarily economic, with the Nizaris paying tribute for safe passage through Crusader territories. But there were also suggestions of deeper connections. Some accounts describe Templar knights learning Arabic and studying Ismaili texts, leading to later accusations that the Templars had been corrupted by assassin doctrines. When the Templars were suppressed in 1307, charges of holding secret doctrines and practicing strange rituals echoed earlier accusations against the assassins. The diplomatic protocols developed for dealing with the old man of the mountain revealed European attempts to fit the Nizaris into familiar categories. Sinan was sometimes treated as an independent monarch, sometimes as a rebellious vassal of larger powers, sometimes as a religious authority like the Pope. Envoys reported confusion about whether to negotiate with him as a temporal ruler or spiritual leader, whether his word could bind his successors, whether agreements required religious or secular guarantees. The actual practices of the Syrian Nizaris under Sinan were both more mundane and more sophisticated than European legends suggested. The selection and training of fedayeen followed methods similar to those used at Alamut, emphasizing education, physical conditioning, and ideological commitment rather than drugs or deception. Intelligence gathering relied on patient cultivation of sources and careful analysis rather than magical powers. Diplomatic negotiations involved calculated assessment of interests rather than mystical manipulation. The economic relationships between the Nizaris and Crusader states were extensive but rarely mentioned in chronicles focused on violence and mystery. Nizari merchants traded in Crusader ports, bringing goods from the interior and carrying Christian products back to Muslim lands. Nizari physicians treated Christian patients, with some accounts suggesting they possessed medical knowledge superior to European practices. Nizari scholars engaged in philosophical discussions with Christian theologians, though these exchanges were limited by linguistic barriers and mutual suspicion. The influence of assassin legends on European literature and imagination extended far beyond the medieval period. The image of the dedicated killer, programmed or convinced to sacrifice himself for a cause, became a recurring motif in Western narratives about the East. The old man of the mountain evolved into an archetype of the manipulative Oriental despot, controlling fanatical followers through mysterious means. These images would influence European colonialism, Orientalist scholarship, and modern terrorism discourse. The reality of Christian-Nizari relations was far more complex than the legend suggested. Both sides were pragmatic political actors operating in a multipolar environment where religious identity was only one factor among many. The Nizaris were neither mindless fanatics nor mystical sages, but rational actors pursuing their community's survival and prosperity. The Crusaders who dealt with them were neither purely motivated by religious zeal nor completely cynical, but navigating complex situations with limited understanding. The death of Sinan in 1193 marked the end of the classical period of Syrian Nizari power. His successors lacked his charismatic authority and diplomatic skill. The rise of more powerful Muslim states, particularly the Ayyubids, and later the Mamluks, reduced Nizari autonomy. The Mongol invasions would eventually destroy both the Persian and Syrian centers of Nizari power. But the legend of the old man of the mountain had achieved immortality, transcending historical accuracy to become a permanent feature of Western mythology about the Islamic world. The transformation of the Nizaris from historical actors to legendary figures reveals the power of narrative in shaping cross-cultural understanding. Europeans, confronted with a phenomenon they could not easily categorize or comprehend, created stories that made sense within their own worldview. These stories, more compelling than complex historical reality, spread and evolved through generations of retelling. The Nizaris became what Europeans needed them to be: mysterious, dangerous, and ultimately incomprehensible others who justified both fear and fascination. The actual Nizari achievements in creating an independent state, developing sophisticated theological doctrines, and surviving for nearly 2 centuries among hostile powers were obscured by sensational legends. Their contributions to Islamic philosophy, science, and literature were forgotten in favor of tales of drugs and daggers. Their complex political relationships were reduced to simple narratives of fanaticism and manipulation. The legend consumed the reality, leaving only the shadow of the assassins in Western memory. Yet perhaps this transformation into legend was itself a form of survival. The historical Nizari state would be destroyed, its fortresses ruined, its libraries burned. But the image of the old man of the mountain and his devoted followers would endure in literature, art, and popular imagination. The assassins achieved a different kind of immortality than Hassan-i Sabbah might have envisioned, living on not as preservers of divine truth, but as symbols of dedication, mystery, and the ultimate price of absolute faith. The legend, however distorted, ensured that the Nizaris would never be completely forgotten, even if they would never be accurately remembered. The dust clouds rising from the east in 1253 were not the seasonal storms that sometimes swept across the Iranian plateau, but harbingers of catastrophe that would consume civilizations from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongol armies advancing toward Persia represented a force unlike anything the Islamic world had previously encountered, a military machine that had perfected the art of systematic destruction and showed neither mercy nor interest in the theological disputes that had defined Middle Eastern politics for centuries. For the Nizari Ismailis, secure in their mountain fortresses for over a century and a half, the approaching storm would prove to be the one enemy their strategies of assassination, fortification, and theological sophistication could not defeat. The Mongol expansion under Genghis Khan had initially bypassed the Nizari territories, focusing on the rich cities of Khwarezm and Transoxiana in the 1220s. The Nizaris had observed the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire with mixed feelings, as it eliminated a potential threat while demonstrating the terrifying effectiveness of Mongol warfare. Some Nizari leaders had even attempted to establish diplomatic relations with the Mongols, sending envoys with tribute and declarations of submission. These early contacts created an illusion that the Nizaris might navigate Mongol expansion, as they had survived Seljuk, Khwarezmian, and other threats through diplomacy and strategic accommodation. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 had provided a reprieve, as his successors focused on consolidating their vast conquests and fighting succession disputes. During this period, the Nizari state under Imam Ala al-Din Muhammad III attempted to strengthen its position through traditional means. Fortresses were reinforced, supplies stockpiled, and diplomatic contacts expanded. The Imam even sent envoys to European courts, seeking alliances against the Mongol threat that menaced both Christian and Muslim powers. These efforts reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Mongol intentions and capabilities. The accession of Mongke Khan as Great Khan in 1251 marked a new phase of Mongol expansion characterized by systematic planning and overwhelming force. Mongke decided to complete the conquest of the Islamic world, assigning this task to his brother Hulagu Khan. The instructions were explicit and chilling in their simplicity. Destroy any power that might resist Mongol rule, with particular emphasis on the Nizari Ismailis and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The Mongols viewed the Nizaris not as a negotiating partner, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. Hulagu Khan, born around 1218, combined Mongol military genius with an intellectual curiosity unusual among Genghis Khan's descendants. He surrounded himself with advisors from various traditions, including Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, Armenian Christians, and even Nestorian Christian priests, as his mother and favorite wife were Christians. This cosmopolitan court gave Hulagu a sophisticated understanding of the lands he was conquering, but it did not translate into mercy for those who resisted. His campaign against the Nizaris would demonstrate the Mongol capacity for methodical annihilation. The preparation for Hulagu's western campaign was meticulous and massive. Starting from Mongolia in 1253, his army numbered at least 150,000 warriors, possibly more, including contingents from every part of the Mongol Empire. Chinese siege engineers brought the latest catapults and battering rams. Muslim engineers who had survived earlier conquests were pressed into service, their knowledge of local fortifications invaluable. The logistics train stretched for miles, carrying supplies for a campaign intended to last years. This was not a raiding expedition, but a permanent conquest. As Hulagu's forces moved westward, smaller powers scrambled to demonstrate submission. Cities that had resisted previous conquerors opened their gates without fighting. Rulers who had maintained independence for generations prostrated themselves before Mongol envoys. The psychological impact of the approaching army was almost as devastating as its physical presence. Stories of Mongol atrocities, some exaggerated but many accurate, preceded their arrival, breaking resistance before battle was joined. The Nizari Imam at this time was Rukn al-Din Khursha, a young man who had assumed power in 1255, just as the Mongol threat was becoming immediate. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent but indecisive, torn between advisors advocating resistance and those urging submission. His position was genuinely impossible. The strategies that had preserved Nizari independence against previous enemies were useless against an opponent who had no local roots to undermine, no religious sensibilities to navigate, and no political rivalries to exploit. The first Mongol demands reached Alamut in early 1256, requiring complete submission, the dismantling of fortifications, and the personal appearance of the Imam before Hulagu. Rukn al-Din attempted to negotiate, sending envoys with rich gifts and promises of tribute. He offered to surrender some fortresses while retaining others, to provide military assistance against Mongol enemies, to accept Mongol overlordship while maintaining internal autonomy. These proposals, which might have worked with Seljuk or Ayyubid rulers, were contemptuously rejected. Hulagu wanted nothing less than complete capitulation. The Mongol forces began their systematic approach to Nizari territories in May 1256. Unlike previous invaders who had attempted direct assaults on major fortresses, the Mongols methodically eliminated smaller positions first, cutting communication lines and isolating major strongholds. Villages that had supported the Nizaris for generations were destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved. Agricultural infrastructure carefully developed over decades was deliberately ruined, ensuring that even if fortresses held out, they would eventually starve. The siege techniques employed by the Mongols represented a revolution in military technology. Chinese engineers constructed catapults that could hurl stones weighing several hundred pounds, gradually pulverizing walls that had stood for centuries. They used incendiary weapons, possibly including early gunpowder devices, to set fire to wooden structures within fortresses. Most innovatively, they employed psychological warfare on a scale the Nizaris had never encountered. Prisoners were forced to assault their own former fortresses, creating moral dilemmas for defenders. The heads of defeated garrison commanders were catapulted into still resisting fortresses. Rukn al-Din's response to the Mongol advance revealed the paralysis that had overtaken Nizari leadership. He moved between fortresses, unable to decide whether to concentrate forces for a last stand or maintain dispersed resistance. He continued sending envoys to Hulagu, each mission offering greater concessions than the last. He even offered to demolish Alamut's fortifications himself if allowed to retain the castle as a residence. These desperate proposals only convinced Hulagu that the Nizari leader was weak and that complete victory was achievable. The siege of Meymun-Diz, where Rukn al-Din had taken refuge, began in November 1256. This fortress, considered even stronger than Alamut, was subjected to continuous bombardment by Mongol catapults. The Chinese engineers constructed siege weapons on site using local materials but applying techniques perfected in the conquest of Chinese cities. The psychological pressure was intense, with Hulagu himself appearing before the walls to demand surrender, promising mercy if Rukn al-Din submitted and total annihilation if he continued resistance. After only a few days of bombardment, Rukn al-Din's resolve crumbled. On November 19, 1256, he emerged from Meymun-Diz and submitted to Hulagu. The surrender was elaborately staged to demonstrate Mongol supremacy and Nizari humiliation. Rukn al-Din prostrated himself before Hulagu, who who treated him with calculated courtesy that emphasized his new status as a powerless dependent. The Imam was kept in comfortable captivity but required to issue orders for the surrender of all remaining Nizari fortresses. The fall of Alamut followed inevitably from Rukn al-Din's capitulation. The great fortress that had never fallen to enemy assault, that had been the spiritual and intellectual center of the Nizari movement since 1090, surrendered without a fight in December 1256. Mongol forces entered the Eagle's Nest to find treasures accumulated over a century and a half, gold and silver certainly, but more importantly, the legendary library containing not just Ismaili texts, but knowledge from across the Islamic world and beyond. The fate of Alamut's library remains one of history's great cultural tragedies. Hulagu's advisor, the Persian scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, was permitted to save some astronomical texts and instruments before the destruction began. Tusi, who had lived among the Nizaris and possibly converted to Ismailism before switching his allegiance to the Mongols, knew the library's value. He rescued what he could, but this was a tiny fraction of the collection. The rest was deliberately burned, with Mongol soldiers using precious manuscripts as fuel for their campfires. The systematic destruction of Nizari fortresses continued through 1257. Each stronghold was not merely captured, but obliterated, its walls pulled down stone by stone, its water systems destroyed, its agricultural terraces ruined. The Mongols intended not just to defeat the Nizaris, but to ensure they could never reconstitute their power. Sites that had been continuously inhabited for centuries became uninhabitable ruins. The elaborate irrigation systems that had made mountain agriculture possible were deliberately wrecked, ensuring the land could not support significant populations. The treatment of Nizari populations varied but was generally harsh. Those who surrendered early were sometimes allowed to survive as slaves or tributary subjects. Those who resisted were massacred without distinction of age or gender. Entire communities that had maintained Ismaili faith for generations disappeared entirely. The sophisticated social structure that had characterized Nizari society, with its emphasis on education and communal support, was completely shattered. Survivors scattered, hiding their religious identity to avoid persecution. Rukn al-Din's final fate reflected Mongol pragmatism and cruelty. After using him to secure the surrender of remaining fortresses, Hulagu sent him to Aga Khan's court in Mongolia, ostensibly to receive confirmation of his submission. On the journey, somewhere in Central Asia, Rukn al-Din and his entourage were murdered by their Mongol guards. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but the result was certain. The Nizari imamate that had provided spiritual leadership for nearly 2 centuries was apparently extinguished. The destruction of the Persian Nizari state was so complete that for centuries historians believed the Ismaili movement had been entirely eradicated. The fortresses were reduced to ruins that would remain uninhabited for generations. The libraries and their irreplaceable contents were ash. The communities that had supported the movement were dispersed or destroyed. The theological and philosophical works developed over a century and a half of intellectual activity were lost forever. The sophisticated administrative and military structures that had allowed a small community to maintain independence were completely dismantled. Yet even Mongol thoroughness could not achieve total annihilation. Some Nizaris escaped to remote valleys where Mongol forces did not penetrate. Others fled to India, Central Asia, or Syria, where Ismaili communities already existed. Many practiced taqiyya, concealing their beliefs and blending into Sunni or Twelver Shia communities. The knowledge preserved in human memory, if not in written texts, would allow the eventual reconstitution of Ismaili tradition, though much would be permanently lost. The Syrian Nizaris initially fared better than their Persian counterparts. The Mongol advance was slower in reaching Syria, and local Nizari leaders had more time to prepare. Some Syrian fortresses negotiated tributary status with the Mongols, maintaining nominal autonomy in exchange for regular payments. However, this reprieve was temporary. The Mamluk Sultanate, which emerged as the primary opponent to Mongol expansion in the region, would systematically reduce Nizari fortresses in Syria during the 1260s and 1270s. The Mongol destruction of the Nizari state had implications beyond the immediate catastrophe. It demonstrated that the traditional strategies of Islamic resistance, whether conventional military force or the asymmetric methods perfected by the Nizaris, were ineffective against an enemy operating by completely different rules. The Mongols cared nothing for Islamic theology, were immune to assassination of individual leaders, and possessed military capabilities that made traditional fortifications obsolete. The scholarly losses from the destruction of Nizari libraries cannot be quantified, but were certainly immense. Beyond specifically Ismaili texts, these libraries had preserved works from various traditions that existed nowhere else. Scientific observations, philosophical treatises, historical chronicles, and literary works accumulated over centuries were lost in days. The destruction contributed to the broader catastrophe of knowledge that accompanied the Mongol conquests, setting back Islamic intellectual development by generations. The psychological impact on surviving Ismaili communities was profound and lasting. The belief that the Imam and his fortresses were divinely protected had been shattered. The expectation that the period of concealment would end with triumph rather than catastrophe required theological reinterpretation. The confidence that allowed small communities to maintain their distinct identity against overwhelming opposition was severely damaged. Many Ismailis concluded that survival required complete concealment rather than any form of open resistance. The Mongol conquest also transformed how the Nizaris were remembered in Islamic historiography. With their power broken and their threat eliminated, Muslim historians could write about them more objectively, though still generally hostilely. The Nizaris evolved from contemporary threats to historical curiosities, their actual beliefs and practices increasingly obscured by legend and propaganda. The destruction of their own historical records meant that their story would be told primarily by their enemies. Hulagu's campaign continued after destroying the Nizaris, culminating in the conquest of Baghdad in 1258 and the execution of the last Abbasid caliph. The Mongol advance was finally stopped by the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, establishing a frontier that would persist for decades. But for the Nizaris, these broader historical developments were irrelevant. Their state was gone, their leadership apparently extinct, their communities scattered and hidden. The ruins of Alamut would remain abandoned for centuries, visited only by shepherds and treasure hunters. The sophisticated water systems fell into decay, the gardens returned to wilderness, the great library halls stood empty and roofless. Occasionally, local people would carry away stones for building projects, gradually reducing even the ruins. The eagle's nest that had dominated the strategic valley became just another mountain ruin, its significance known only to local folklore. The contrast between Nizari resistance to previous enemies and their collapse before the Mongols revealed fundamental truths about power and survival. Against enemies who shared basic cultural assumptions and operated within established political frameworks, unconventional strategies could succeed. But against an enemy that recognized no limits and sought total destruction rather than accommodation, such strategies were worthless. The Nizaris had perfected the art of asymmetric warfare within Islamic civilization, but had no answer to an external force that threatened that civilization itself. The documentation of the Mongol conquest, primarily from Mongol and Persian sources hostile to the Nizaris, shaped how this event would be remembered. The emphasis was on Mongol invincibility and Nizari weakness, on the inevitability of conquest and the futility of resistance. The genuine tragedy of cultural destruction was minimized, with some historians even celebrating the elimination of what they considered a heretical threat. The human cost in lives destroyed and communities scattered was reduced to statistics when mentioned at all. As 1257 ended and 1258 began, the Nizari Ismaili state that had existed since 1090 was effectively extinct. The mountain fortresses that had seemed impregnable were ruins. The libraries that had preserved centuries of knowledge were ash. The communities that had created a unique synthesis of religious devotion, intellectual achievement, and political independence were scattered to the winds. The great experiment in creating an alternative form of Islamic society had ended in complete catastrophe. Yet even in this darkest moment, seeds of survival had been scattered that would eventually grow into new forms of Ismaili life, though never again would they attempt to challenge the powerful through fortress and dagger. The smoke had barely cleared from the ruins of Alamut when the survivors began their long journey into shadows and silence. Those who escaped the Mongol destruction faced a terrible choice that would define Ismaili existence for centuries: abandon the faith that had given their lives meaning, or preserve it through concealment and dissimulation, maintaining their beliefs behind masks of orthodoxy. The grand experiment of an independent Ismaili state was over, but the faith itself would prove more resilient than the fortresses that had once protected it, adapting to survival in diaspora through methods that Hassan-i Sabbah might never have imagined. The practice of taqiyya, religious dissimulation, permitted in Shia Islam when facing persecution, became the essential survival strategy for Nizari communities after 1256. What had once been an occasional expedient for Ismailis living in hostile territory now became the permanent condition for virtually all survivors. Entire communities learned to perform Sunni or Twelver Shia prayers in public, while maintaining Ismaili beliefs in private. Children were taught from earliest age to show one face to the world and another within the safety of their homes, a psychological burden that would shape Ismaili identity for generations. The scattered Nizari communities developed elaborate codes and secret signs to recognize fellow believers without exposing themselves to persecution. A particular way of greeting, specific phrases embedded in ordinary conversation, subtle symbols in architecture or decorative arts allowed Ismailis to identify each other while remaining invisible to hostile authorities. Marriages were arranged within the community through networks that operated below the surface of society, maintaining bloodlines and beliefs across vast distances without ever acknowledging their connections publicly. In Persia, where the destruction had been most complete, survivors fled to remote regions where state authority was weak. The mountains of Mazandaran, the deserts of Kerman, the isolated valleys of Badakhshan became refuges for small Ismaili communities. They lived as farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, indistinguishable from their neighbors, except for secret gatherings, where they preserved what they could remember of Nizari teachings. Without access to texts destroyed in the Mongol conquest, they relied on oral tradition, with inevitable changes and losses as memories faded and interpretations evolved. The question of leadership posed an existential challenge for these scattered communities. The death of Rukn al-Din Kosha had apparently ended the line of imams that provided spiritual authority for the Nizari faith. Yet many refused to believe the imamate could simply end. Stories circulated that Rukn al-Din's son, Shams al-Din Muhammad, had survived in hiding. Whether true or not, the belief in a hidden imam maintaining spiritual authority, despite physical absence, allowed communities to preserve their faith even without visible leadership. The concept of the concealed imam, which had been theological theory under Hassan-i Sabbah, became lived reality for post-Alamut Ismailis. In Syria, the situation initially appeared more hopeful. Some Nizari fortresses had negotiated tributary status with the Mongols and maintained nominal autonomy. The Syrian Ismailis, always somewhat independent from Alamut, attempted to continue their existence under new political arrangements. However, the rise of the Mamluk Sultanate, which positioned itself as the defender of Sunni orthodoxy against both Mongol paganism and Islamic heterodoxy, gradually eliminated these remnants of Nizari power. By 1273, the last Syrian Nizari fortresses had fallen to Mamluk forces. The Syrian Ismailis who survived adopted different strategies from their Persian counterparts. Many integrated into the Alawite communities of coastal Syria, whose esoteric beliefs and practices provided cover for Ismaili traditions. Others maintained their identity through involvement in Sufi orders, where mystical practices and hierarchical initiation structures resembled aspects of Ismailism. The boundaries between these various esoteric groups became fluid, with centuries of intermarriage and theological exchange creating synthetic traditions that preserved Ismaili elements within new frameworks. The most successful preservation of Nizari tradition occurred in South Asia, where Ismaili communities had existed since Fatimid times. The Mongol destruction never reached India, allowing these communities to provide refuge for Persian Ismailis fleeing persecution. The sultans of Delhi and later regional rulers were generally tolerant of religious minorities that posed no political threat. Ismailis in Gujarat, Sindh, and other regions developed thriving mercantile communities using commercial networks to maintain contact with scattered co-religionists across the Indian Ocean trade routes. The Indian Ismailis, known as Khojas in Gujarat and Sindh, developed unique adaptations that allowed their faith to survive and even prosper. They adopted local languages, creating a devotional literature called Ginans that expressed Ismaili concepts through Hindu imagery and terminology. This syncretism allowed them to practice their faith more openly, while appearing to outsiders as simply another devotional tradition within South Asia's complex religious landscape. The Ginans preserved core Ismaili teachings about the Imam, the nature of spiritual authority, and the relationship between external practice and internal truth, but in forms that would have seemed foreign to the scholars of Alamut. Central Asian communities, particularly in Badakhshan and the Pamir Mountains, preserved perhaps the purest forms of post-Alamut Nizari tradition. The isolation of these regions, combined with weak state control, allowed Ismailis to practice their faith with less concealment than elsewhere. They maintained the tradition of the hidden imam while developing local religious authorities who provided practical leadership. These communities preserved ancient texts that had survived the Mongol destruction, copying and recopying manuscripts that became increasingly precious as connections with other Ismaili communities weakened. The transformation from a military political movement to peaceful religious communities was gradual but profound. The doctrine of assassination, which had defined Nizari identity for outsiders, became completely irrelevant for scattered communities focused on survival. The fortress strongholds were replaced by neighborhood prayer halls. The fedayeen warriors gave way to merchants and farmers. The elaborate hierarchy of dais and administrators simplified into local community leadership. The revolutionary ideology that had challenged the established order evolved into quietist teachings emphasizing patience, endurance, and spiritual rather than temporal goals. The economic adaptation of post-Alamut Ismailis was remarkably successful in many regions. Denied access to land ownership and political power in most areas, they focused on trade and crafts. Ismaili merchants developed reputation for honesty and reliability that made them preferred partners in long-distance trade. Their networks of co-religionists across vast distances provided natural commercial advantages, with trust relationships that reduced transaction costs and enabled credit arrangements. This mercantile success would eventually provide the economic foundation for the community's revival. The preservation of religious knowledge during this period of concealment required extraordinary dedication. Without central institutions or libraries, individual families became repositories of tradition. Manuscripts were hidden in walls or buried for protection, retrieved only for secret copying sessions. Religious teachers traveled in disguise between communities, sharing what knowledge they retained and trying to maintain some consistency of belief and practice. Yet inevitably, isolation led to divergence. Different communities developed varying interpretations of core doctrines, created local traditions, and adapted to regional contexts in ways that would have been impossible under centralized authority. The role of women in preserving Ismaili tradition during the concealment period deserves particular recognition. While men often had to participate more fully in public religious life to avoid suspicion, women could maintain Ismaili practices within the private sphere of the home. Mothers taught children the true faith through lullabies and stories that encoded religious teachings. Women's gatherings for celebrations and mourning became occasions for transmitting tradition. The domestic space, traditionally women's domain, became the primary site for maintaining Ismaili identity when public expression was impossible. The emergence of the Aga Khan lineage as acknowledged leaders of the Nizari Ismailis marked the beginning of the end of the concealment period. The precise genealogical connections between the post-Mongol imams and the Alamut leadership remains historically disputed, but by the 15th century a line of imams claiming descent from the Nizari imams had established themselves in the village of Anjudan in central Persia. These imams initially maintained very low profiles, known only to inner circles of Ismaili communities, while presenting themselves publicly as Sufi masters or Twelver Shia religious figures. The Anjudan revival, as historians term it, began in the late 15th century as these imams gradually extended their influence over scattered Ismaili communities. They sent representatives to India, Syria, Central Asia, and other regions where Ismailis survived, re-establishing connections broken for centuries. The representatives brought letters from the imam providing religious guidance and confirming his spiritual authority. They also collected religious taxes, the zakat and khums, which provided economic resources for the imamate while reinforcing communal bonds. The success of the Anjudan revival depended on maintaining the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. The imams needed to be accessible enough to provide leadership while avoiding attention from hostile authorities. They cultivated relationships with regional rulers, often providing financial services or diplomatic assistance in exchange for protection. They maintained the fiction of being Sufi leaders or Orthodox Shia clerics, while secretly corresponding with Ismaili communities. This period saw the development of sophisticated networks that would eventually enable the open re-emergence of the Ismaili imamate. Shah Khalil Allah, who became imam in 1817, made the decisive move from Persia to India, recognizing that the British colonial regime provided better conditions for religious minorities than the increasingly intolerant Qajar dynasty in Persia. His assassination in 1817 in Yazd while still in Persia demonstrated the continuing dangers faced by Ismaili leaders. His young son, Hassan-i Shah, inherited not just the imamate but also the need to find a secure base for the community's leadership. Hassan-i Shah, who would become known as Aga Khan, transformed the Ismaili imamate from a hidden religious authority into a public institution. Born in 1804, he received the title Aga Khan from the Persian Shah in 1818, marking the first time in centuries that an Ismaili imam held acknowledged public position. His career combined religious leadership with political involvement, serving as governor of Kerman province before political conflicts forced his exile to India in 1842. This exile, initially a defeat, proved to be the foundation for the modern Ismaili Renaissance. In British India, Aga Khan, I found an environment where religious leadership could be exercised openly without fear of persecution. The British colonial authorities, following policies of religious neutrality and divide and rule, welcomed a religious leader who could command loyalty from mercantile communities across their empire. The Aga Khan established himself in Bombay, where the prosperous Khoja community provided economic support and social foundation for rebuilding Ismaili institutions. Legal recognition came through the famous Aga Khan case of 1866, where British courts confirmed his authority over the Khoja community. The transformation under the Aga Khans was not without controversy. Many Khojas had practiced their faith for so long in concealment that they resisted open acknowledgement of their Ismaili identity. Some communities split, with portions remaining crypto-Ismailis or joining 12 Shia or Sunni communities. The synthesis of Hindu and Islamic elements that had developed during centuries of concealment was challenged by efforts to establish more standardized practices, yet the majority accepted the imam's authority and welcomed the opportunity to practice their faith openly after centuries of hiding. The economic modernization promoted by the Aga Khans transformed Ismaili communities from marginal minorities into prosperous and educated populations. Aga Khan III, who led the community from 1885 to 1957, particularly emphasized education and economic development. He established schools, hospitals, and financial institutions that served not just Ismailis, but broader populations. The Ismaili commitment to education, especially including women's education, created professional classes that succeeded in colonial and post-colonial societies. The community that had once challenged the established order through assassination and fortress now influenced society through business, education, and philanthropy. The geographical dispersion that had begun as tragedy became a source of strength. Ismaili communities established during the diaspora created networks spanning from Central Asia to East Africa, from the Middle East to South Asia. These networks facilitated not just religious connections but economic and social exchanges that benefited all members. The experience of survival through adaptation made Ismailis particularly successful in navigating the modern globalized world. The religious evolution during the concealment period produced an Ismailism quite different from that practiced at Alamut. The emphasis on external law versus internal truth that had justified antinomian practices gave way to emphasis on ethical living and social responsibility. The expectation of imminent apocalyptic transformation evolved into acceptance of gradual progress through human effort. The warrior ethos of the fedayeen transformed into commitment to service and sacrifice for communal benefit. These changes were not rejections of the past but adaptations that preserved core beliefs while discarding practices unsuited to changed circumstances. The preservation of Ismaili identity through centuries of persecution and concealment demonstrated remarkable resilience. Communities that had every reason to abandon a faith that brought danger and discrimination instead maintained it through extraordinary effort and sacrifice. The strategies developed for survival, from taqiyya to commercial networks, from oral tradition to syncretic adaptation, allowed not just survival but eventual revival. The scattered seeds from Alamut's destruction had grown into a worldwide community that, while different from Hassan-i Sabbah's vision, maintained continuity with the spiritual tradition he had fought to preserve. The modern Ismaili community's relationship with its assassin past remains complex. The historical period of the Nizari state is acknowledged but carefully contextualized, emphasized as a response to particular historical circumstances rather than defining characteristic of the faith. The emphasis is on continuity of spiritual authority through the imamate, rather than on specific political or military strategies. The community that once terrified the medieval world through targeted violence now builds hospitals and universities, promoting pluralism and development rather than revolution. The story of Ismaili survival and transformation, from the ashes of Alamut to the global community of today, represents one of history's remarkable examples of religious resilience. The journey from mountain fortresses to corporate boardrooms, from concealment to prominence, from revolutionary violence to peaceful development, demonstrates the capacity of religious communities to adapt while maintaining essential identity. The Nizari Ismailis survived not by preserving every aspect of their past, but by identifying core values and beliefs that could be expressed in new forms suited to changing circumstances. The assassins, as a political military force, died with the Mongol conquest, but the spiritual tradition they had fought to preserve proved more durable than the strongest fortress, surviving through the devotion of ordinary believers who kept faith alive through the darkest of times. The helicopter descended through morning clouds toward the ruins of Alamut in 1960, carrying Peter Willey, the British archaeologist who would conduct the first systematic study of the fortress since its destruction 7 centuries earlier. As the mist cleared, revealing scattered stones and crumbling foundations where once stood the most feared fortress in the medieval Islamic world, Willey was witnessing not just archaeological remains, but the physical intersection of legend and reality. The modern effort to understand the historical assassins had begun, even as their descendants were transforming from a hidden minority into one of the most progressive communities in the Islamic world. The transformation of the Ismaili community under Aga Khan IV, who assumed the imamate in 1957 at age 20, represented a remarkable synthesis of tradition and modernity. Prince Karim Aga Khan, educated at Harvard and born into a world utterly different from the mountain fortresses of medieval Persia, understood that the community's survival and prosperity required engagement with contemporary realities rather than retreat into historical memory. His vision would transform the Ismailis from a recovering diaspora community into a global network committed to pluralism, development, and the improvement of human society. The Aga Khan Development Network, established in the 1960s, became the primary vehicle for implementing this vision. Rather than focusing solely on Ismaili communities, the network's hospitals, schools, universities, and economic development programs served populations regardless of religious affiliation. In Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, East Africa, and Central Asia, institutions bearing the Aga Khan name became synonymous with quality healthcare and education. This approach reversed centuries of isolation, positioning Ismailis as contributors to broader society rather than a separate, secretive minority. The emphasis on education that had characterized the Nizari state at Alamut found new expression in modern institutions. The Aga Khan University, established in 1983 with its first campus in Karachi, Pakistan, grew into an international institution with programs in medicine, nursing, education, and liberal arts. The university's admission policies explicitly promoted diversity, bringing together students from different religious, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. The Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, founded in 1977, became a centre for academic research into Ismaili history and thought, working to recover and preserve texts and traditions nearly lost during centuries of persecution. The recovery of Ismaili historical memory required confronting both hostile external narratives and internal amnesia caused by centuries of concealment. Many Ismailis themselves knew little of their history beyond family traditions and simplified religious narratives. The systematic study of Ismaili history, utilizing modern academic methods and previously inaccessible sources, revealed a complexity that challenged both Western stereotypes and community mythologies. The violent revolutionaries of Orientalist imagination and the purely peaceful mystics of apologetic tradition both gave way to a more nuanced understanding of a community that had adapted to dramatically different historical circumstances. Archaeological investigations at Alamut and other Nizari sites provided material evidence that often contradicted literary sources. Willie's excavations revealed sophisticated water management systems, architectural innovations adapted to mountain environments, and evidence of agricultural development that suggested a community focused as much on construction as destruction. Later excavations found fragments of the destroyed library, including astronomical instruments and manuscript pieces that confirmed accounts of Alamut as a center of learning. The fortress that had loomed so large in imagination proved more modest in physical scale but more complex in function than legend suggested. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 renewed interest in Alamut within Iran itself, though from perspectives often at odds with historical accuracy. The revolutionary government's search for indigenous symbols of resistance to foreign domination led to partial rehabilitation of the assassins as anti-imperialist fighters, though their Ismaili theology remained problematic for the Twelver Shia establishment. Iranian archaeologists continued excavations, and the site became a tourist destination for Iranians and international visitors drawn by its dramatic history and spectacular mountain setting. The preservation efforts at Alamut faced unique challenges. Unlike conventional archaeological sites, where reconstruction might be possible, the systematic Mongol destruction had left little standing architecture. The remote location made conservation difficult and expensive. Most problematically, the site's significance was contested, with different groups projecting their own meanings onto the ruins. For Ismailis, it represented both ancestral glory and tragic loss. For Iranian nationalists, it symbolized resistance to foreign domination. For Western visitors, it embodied Oriental mystery and violence. These competing narratives complicated efforts to present the site's actual historical significance. Popular culture's fascination with the assassins continued to evolve through the 20th and 21st centuries, though rarely with attention to historical accuracy. The word assassin itself, divorced from its historical context, became simply a synonym for professional killer in dozens of languages. Video games, particularly the Assassin's Creed franchise launched in 2007, introduced millions to a highly fictionalized version of the Nizari Ismailis, mixing historical elements with fantasy in ways that simultaneously spread awareness and misinformation about the medieval movement. Literary treatments ranged from serious historical fiction attempting to capture the complexity of the Nizari experience to sensationalist thrillers perpetuating the most lurid legends. Writers like Vladimir Bartol, whose novel Alamut became influential despite its minimal historical accuracy, used the assassins as vehicles for exploring themes of political manipulation and religious fanaticism that had little to do with actual Ismaili history. More thoughtful authors like Amin Maalouf attempted to present the Nizaris within their historical context, though even sympathetic treatments often emphasized the exotic and violent aspects that readers expected. The academic study of the Nizari Ismailis underwent revolutionary changes as previously unavailable sources became accessible. The Institute of Ismaili Studies and other institutions sponsored critical editions of surviving Ismaili texts, many preserved in private collections that had been hidden for centuries. Scholars like Farhad Daftari produced comprehensive histories that synthesized Persian, Arabic, and European sources, revealing the biases and limitations of hostile accounts that had long dominated the narrative. The image of drug-crazed fanatics gave way to understanding of a sophisticated religious and political movement operating within specific historical constraints. The relationship between modern Ismailis and their assassin heritage remained complex and sometimes uncomfortable. Community leaders emphasized the historical context that made violence necessary for survival, while stressing that contemporary Ismailism rejected such methods entirely. Young Ismailis growing up in Western countries often first learned about their heritage through popular culture's distorted lens, requiring education efforts to provide accurate historical understanding. The community that had once hidden its identity now had to manage a historical reputation that was simultaneously infamous and misunderstood. The Aga Khan's approach to this historical legacy was sophisticated and nuanced. Rather than denying or apologizing for the Nizari period, he contextualized it within the broader sweep of Ismaili history, extending back to the early Islamic period and forward to the present. The emphasis was on continuity of spiritual authority and communal values rather than specific historical practices. The warriors of Alamut and the professionals of London or Toronto were connected not through methods but through maintenance of a distinctive spiritual tradition and communal identity. The architectural projects sponsored by the Aga Khan created new forms of Islamic architecture that subtly referenced Ismaili history while engaging with contemporary design. The Ismaili centres built in London, Vancouver, Dubai, Dushanbe, and other cities combined traditional Islamic geometric patterns with modern materials and functions. These buildings served not just as prayer spaces but as cultural centres, promoting understanding between different communities. Their gardens often included symbolic references to the gardens of Alamut, transformed from legends of false paradise into real spaces for contemplation and community gathering. The restoration and preservation of historic sites throughout the Islamic world by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture went beyond specifically Ismaili monuments to include major Sunni and Shia sites. The restoration of Humayun's tomb in Delhi, the creation of Al-Azhar Park in Cairo, and the rehabilitation of historic cities in Afghanistan and Syria demonstrated commitment to Islamic civilization's broader heritage. This inclusive approach positioned the Aga Khan as a defender of Islamic culture generally rather than sectarian interests, earning respect across traditional divides. The economic philosophy promoted by modern Ismaili institutions reflected lessons learned through centuries of marginalization and adaptation. The emphasis on ethical business practices, microfinance for poverty alleviation, and economic development that benefited entire communities rather than just elites drew from the communal solidarity that had enabled survival during persecution. The Aga Khan Fund for Economic Development operated on principles that would have been familiar to the administrators of Alamut: self-reliance, mutual support, and investment in human capacity. The role of women in contemporary Ismaili communities represented perhaps the most dramatic transformation from historical patterns, though building on precedents established even in medieval times. Women served in leadership positions within community institutions, pursued higher education at rates exceeding men in many countries, and participated fully in economic and professional life. The Aga Khan's consistent emphasis on gender equality as both religious obligation and practical necessity for community development challenged traditional patterns throughout the Islamic world. The global dispersion of Ismailis, accelerated by political upheavals and economic opportunities, created new challenges and opportunities. Communities expelled from Uganda by Idi Amin in 1972 rebuilt in Canada and Britain, becoming successful minorities in their adopted countries. Afghan Ismailis fleeing Soviet invasion and subsequent conflicts established diaspora communities that maintained connections with their homeland while adapting to new contexts. These migrations, traumatic as they were, strengthened the global Ismaili network and demonstrated the resilience developed through centuries of displacement. The concept of the imamate itself evolved to meet contemporary needs while maintaining traditional authority. The Aga Khan functioned simultaneously as spiritual leader providing religious guidance, institutional head managing complex development organizations, and diplomatic figure engaging with governments and international bodies. This multifaceted role required balancing sometimes competing demands while maintaining the spiritual authority that remained the foundation of his leadership. The Harvard-educated prince discussing development economics with World Bank officials was also the hereditary imam whose authority traced back through genealogies to Ali and Fatima. The preservation of Ismaili religious traditions within modern contexts required constant adaptation. Traditional practices like the recitation of ginans were maintained while new forms of religious expression developed. The curriculum of religious education programs balanced teaching of historical traditions with preparation for contemporary challenges. Young Ismailis learned not just prayers and doctrines, but how to explain their faith to non-Muslim classmates and colleagues, how to maintain religious identity in secular societies, and how to contribute to pluralistic communities while preserving distinctiveness. The scholarly reassessment of the Alamut period produced surprising insights about the Nizari contribution to Islamic civilization. Their preservation of philosophical and scientific texts later destroyed elsewhere. Their agricultural innovations in mountain environments and their experiments in creating alternative social structures appeared more significant as complete evidence emerged. The image of destructive fanatics was replaced by understanding of a community that combined military resistance with intellectual achievement and social innovation under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The modern engagement with the assassin legacy in popular culture presented both opportunities and challenges. While video games and novels spread wildly inaccurate versions of history, they also created openings for education. The Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, opened in 2014, included exhibitions on Ismaili history that attracted visitors initially drawn by popular culture representations. Academic conferences on the Nizari Ismailis drew audiences beyond specialists, including those whose first exposure came through entertainment media. The challenge was transforming casual interest sparked by fiction into genuine understanding of historical complexity. The relationship between modern Ismailis and contemporary Islamic movements revealed how thoroughly the community had transformed from its revolutionary origins. While some Islamic groups embraced violence in pursuit of political goals, often invoking historical precedents, including the assassins, the Ismaili community consistently advocated peaceful development and pluralistic engagement. The Aga Khan speeches condemning terrorism and promoting dialogue between civilizations positioned Ismailis as advocates for the compatibility of Islamic faith with modern democratic values. The archaeological work at Alamut continued into the 21st century, with new technologies revealing previously hidden aspects of the site. Ground-penetrating radar identified underground chambers and water channels invisible to surface observation. Satellite imagery revealed the full extent of the agricultural terracing system that had supported the fortress community. Chemical analysis of pottery and metal fragments provided insights into daily life and trade connections. Each discovery added detail to the picture of a complex community engaged in far more than the violence that had defined them in popular imagination. The question of what the Nizari Ismailis of Alamut would make of their modern descendants remains fascinating, if unanswerable. Hassan-i Sabbah, the austere revolutionary who executed his own sons for violating religious law, might struggle to recognize the community led by a jet-setting imam promoting gender equality and religious pluralism. The fedayeen who sacrificed their lives in targeted assassinations might puzzle at descendants who built hospitals and schools for people of all faiths. Yet perhaps they would recognize the continuity of dedication to communal survival, the maintenance of distinctive identity despite overwhelming pressures to conform, and the conviction that a small community could influence the broader world through strategic action. The transformation from the assassins of medieval legend to the modern Ismaili community represents one of history's most remarkable examples of religious adaptation. The journey from revolutionary violence to peaceful development, from theological rigidity to pluralistic engagement, from isolated mountain fortresses to global networks, demonstrated that religious traditions could evolve dramatically while maintaining essential continuity. The daggers that once struck fear into the hearts of medieval rulers had been replaced by development programs that improved lives across the developing world. As the ruins of Alamut slowly deteriorate despite preservation efforts, weathered by the same mountain storms that once protected them from invaders, they stand as monuments to both the possibilities and limitations of revolutionary resistance. The Nizari experiment in creating an independent Ismaili state through asymmetric warfare and theological innovation ultimately failed in its immediate objectives, destroyed by forces beyond its ability to resist. Yet the spiritual tradition it fought to preserve survived through adaptation, emerging centuries later in forms that Hassan-i Sabbah could never have imagined, but that fulfilled his deeper goal of maintaining Ismaili identity and faith. The legacy of the assassins in world history extends beyond their specific story to illuminate broader themes of religious minorities navigating hostile environments, the relationship between violence and political change, and the power of narrative in shaping historical memory. Their transformation from one of history's most feared groups to one of Islam's most progressive communities challenges assumptions about the permanence of cultural characteristics and the possibility of radical change. The mountain fortresses are ruins, the gardens have returned to wilderness, and the daggers have been replaced by surgical instruments in Aga Khan hospitals. But the dedication that once drove young men to certain death in service of their faith continues in doctors and teachers serving communities across the developing world. The story that began with Hassan-i Sabbah's conquest of Alamut in 1090 continues today in boardrooms and classrooms, in restored monuments and new universities, in the quiet maintenance of faith by millions of Ismailis worldwide. The assassins as a historical phenomenon ended with the Mongol conquest, but the human story of a community's survival and transformation continues, adding new chapters that would have seemed impossible from the battlements of Alamut. The most enduring legacy of the Nizari Ismailis may not be the legends of their violence, but the demonstration that communities can transform themselves while maintaining their essential identity, that the weakest can survive the strongest through adaptation, and that faith can endure through forms of expression that each generation must discover anew.